Good morning, everyone, and welcome to AEI. My name is Robert Dorr, and I'm the Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. We here in Poverty Studies at AEI have spent the past 2 years supporting and producing important new work on the various issues concerning struggling Americans and how we as a nation can foster greater opportunity, less poverty, and more upward mobility. Today's program, Strong Families, Prosperous States, Do Healthy Families Affect the Wealth of States, is another in a series of programs we have hosted on this broad topic. I learned firsthand in my prior roles as Commissioner of Social Services in New York State and New York City that family structure plays a large role in poverty. We are grateful to Brad Wilcox, Joseph Price, and Rob Learman for bringing forward this important research on the extent to which stronger, more stable married families contribute to stronger economies and more prosperous states. We are also grateful to have a very special guest as our keynote speaker to start us off today. There may be some cynicism about Congress these days, but there can be no cynicism about the junior senator from Nebraska. Senator Sasse is one of the most exciting new senators to come along in a long time. Prior to coming to the Senate with his election in 2014, he spent 5 years as president of Midland College. He has worked with the Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey. He graduated from Harvard and has a PhD in American history from Yale, making him one of those rare individuals who has, as President Kennedy once said, the best of both worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree. Senator Sasse.
I'm embarrassed to say I don't know that joke. I've never heard that before. Where I'm from, you just admit that the reason you go to Harvard or Yale is because you're not good enough to play football for the Huskers. So if you want to keep playing sports, you got to go somewhere where the sports are kind of crappy. So thanks for having me. I'm here. I'm honored to be able to be invited to kick this off. Really, I'm here more as a student than anything else. I have to admit that I do have to sneak out after this to go learn about GMOs. But I have people on my team who are going to stay and live text the whole event to me. So when you look at this list of people, I'm here much more as I'm pointing to the panelists that are going to be here today. I'm here much more as a student than anything else because I'm a student of many of these folks, and I'm going to continue to learn for the next 3 hours from the things that you're going to talk about. But it feels like you can't start an event like this without coming up with a way to make a joke about your family somehow, prosperity and the costs of your own children. I don't have any great joke that links to the prosperity element of today's topic, but I will admit, somebody that's near and dear to many of you in this room, and to Mona in particular, Jay Nordlinger's new book about the families of dictators. If you haven't read this yet, you need to read it. But it's called Children of Monsters. And we, at our house, do something very odd. I think we're the only family in the U.S. Senate who tries to commute as a family. So I have a 14-year-old daughter, an 11-year-old daughter, and a 4-year-old son, and I take somebody with me every week. I'm new to this. I've never done it before. And I don't want them to be raised in Washington, D.C. No disrespect to all of you who figured out a way to get your kids' character here. I just don't know where you would walk beans into tassel corn. And where I'm from, the only way to be certain that your kids are going to grow up right is if you push them out into the fields at 5 in the morning. So they need to grow up in Nebraska, but I also don't want to be away from them Monday to Friday every week. So I take some subset of them with me every week. And they mostly like it. They probably 60-40 prefer to be in Nebraska. So whoever gets the short straw of being dad's date for the week, when it's Sunday afternoon and you realize who's going to get on the plane Monday morning, there's a little bit of lamentation about what they're going to miss at home, but they like a lot of what they get in D.C. as well. But some of what they like is figuring out the way to be faux sophisticated. And so the other day, we're at a book party for Jay, Nordlinger's new book, and my 11-year-old walks out with the book and starts reading it, and it's a fascinating topic. What happens to the families of dictators over time? The sort of spoiler alert, it's bad. You don't want to be a descendant of a dictator. There's a chance, like this highest thing you can aspire to is that you become the next dictator. And that's not really a great life aspiration, but pretty much you're going to end up in a battle with your siblings trying to kill each other because there are going to be so many promiscuous children that are all threats to one another. And anyway, my daughter is sitting there the other day reading Children of Monsters, and somebody walks by and sees her reading it and thinks, well, isn't that nice? That 11-year-old little girl is sitting there reading that book. And my daughter, completely deadpan, doesn't look up from the book and just says, it's my autobiography. So anyway. Our topic is not families in the abstract today, which is a really central and important topic to all of us as humans. But our topic is the link to prosperous societies. And so I'm not going to try to do anything quant serious today because you're going to hear from people who are expert at this, and I'm a big student and fan of Brad's. So I'm not going to pretend I could go toe-to-toe or stay on a plane with any of you on that. But since I very intentionally sit in Daniel Patrick Moynihan's desk, I thought I'd at least look at one bit of historical data and update it, and then I'd like to make two historical observations about the American idea, because what's happening now is a genuine tragedy, not just for the individuals involved. We know that market forces and families are the two most important institutions in human history for lifting people out of poverty. So there's a lot of human tragedy in the numbers that you're going to unpack in some detail today. But there's also a tragedy for the American idea. So I want to just give you one hard piece of data updated and then talk a little bit about what America has always meant and why this should be regarded as an existential crisis for our country, what's happening to our families. The historical quantitative point is in 1965, when Moynihan delivered his address on what was then the conversation of the black family. He was saying that we have a crisis that is going to erupt on us because 25%, it was about 25% of African American children in the US were being born in single parent homes. 25%. That was at a moment when societally, only 7% of kids were being born out of wedlock, 1965. Today, this isn't a racial crisis. This is an everyone crisis. The numbers overall are right about 40% of children today being born out of wedlock. So the disparity was 7% overall and 25% in black families in 1965. Today, it's 40% overall, but the real story is much more urgent than that, because when you disaggregate by the age of mom, what's happening is a cliff that's much more substantial than even 40%, though 40% in the 1960s would have caused everybody across the political spectrum to wonder if this republic could long endure. When you disaggregate by the age of mom, about 60% of children being born to women under age 30 right now are being born out of wedlock. And when you disaggregate not just by the number of children, because obviously people in stable environments are more likely to have children than people who are in unstable environments, when you disaggregate by women as opposed to number of children born, it is almost 2/3 of all women under age 30 who are mothers have had a baby out of wedlock. So I think the hard stat from the Johns Hopkins research is about 64% of moms under age 30 have had at least one or all of their children out of wedlock. That begs lots of questions about what's happening at the level of cultural transmission. It also is an imperative to everybody who cares about this issue to get really sincere at thinking about the rhetoric we use when we talk about these issues, because we're talking to a society that, whether they affirm or disagree with the ideas we're going to talk about today, experientially, 2/3 of the young parents in this country, or the young mothers in this country, have had a kid out of wedlock. And so we need to make sure we can make this case in a way that sounds Arthur Brooksian, if you will. It is an imperative that the conservative heart guide the way we speak about this issue. But when I call it a tragedy, I really do think we need to unbundle the tragedy for the individuals and the tragedy for the American idea. And why do I call it a tragedy for the American idea? I think it's useful when you go back to this question that's going to orient you for most of today, the link between strong and stable families and a prosperous society. It's useful to recognize that at a place like AEI and at many other places across the think tank and intelligentsia of movements that many of us are a part of, and these movements are overlapping, we often find these tensions between different sides of conservatism or or different kinds of movements that we care about. And I think back to some things that Robert George wrote in the weeks after the 2012 election. And he said there needs to be a ceasefire in the two sides of social conservatism and economic conservatism in recognizing that there's a symbiotic codependence here, because common principles lead to both movements, and common enemies, or in some cases singular enemies, are attacking both movements. Paul Ryan, who may well be, or we may well be blessed to have as the next Speaker of the House, has said some very similar things about even if you're only personally committed to one of these two movements, you need to recognize the means and ends dependencies among them. If you're a libertarian who thinks you're disinterested in family, where do you think the human capital is going to come from to support the business enterprises that you're interested in? Or conversely, if you're a social conservative and you believe that we need a full flowering of mediating institutions to enable the transmission of the social beliefs that you have, where do you think the material sustenance is going to come from for this broad ecosystem of mediating institutions? These two movements are linked, but they're not just linked because of common principle. They're linked because of focused enemies who don't believe in the idea of limited government right now. And so the historian in me, and I'm supposed to spend nearly half of our time at question and answer, so I'm going to pull up in this, but the historian in me wants to say, we have to look back to the American founding and fully recognize that the American Revolution was an anti-statist revolution. And the American founding was very self-consciously a part of an anti-statist movement and moment. Limited government is not an end in itself. Limited government is a way to constrain the things that could displace those institutions and those transmission opportunities that define what is fully meaningful in human life and leads to a prosperous and vital and virtuous society. Madison famously said that if men were angels, we would have no need of government, and if governors were angels, we would have no need of separation of powers and limits on government. In the same regard, though, I think it's important, whether you come from the more libertarian end of economic conservatism or if you're more of a Burkean like I am, it's important to recognize that we are all united by a shared goal that's Tocquevillian. Fundamentally, the meaning of the American founding and the meaning of the American Revolution was about this. Most civilizations throughout most of human history have claimed that government is the author of your rights, and the king is the guy who's truly free. If you have the monopoly on violence, you're free to do whatever you want, and everyone else is a dependent subject. You want to found a company, you want to start a not-for-profit, you want to do any of these things, you need a charter from the government, because the passive assumption in most civilizations historically has been prohibition. And permission needs to be granted by government. And we believe something quite different, and by we, I mean much broader than just the two prongs of a conservative movement here. I mean we Americans have believed that the meaning of America centers on the idea that God gives us rights via nature, and government is our shared project to secure those rights. Government is a thing. Government is a tool that enables us to be sure that our natural rights are protected and preserved. We need government as a framework for ordered liberty. And so my comments are named a tiny bit tongue-in-cheek. Family is the word we give to those things we choose to do together. President Obama never, or we haven't been able to find where he ever precisely said government is just the name for those things we choose to do together. But Barney Frank has been saying it for a really long time. And when the DNC has celebrated, not meaning to sound quite this partisan at this moment, but the DNC, when they've celebrated President Obama in videos, in election moments, regularly roll out that Barney Frank quote and put over lots of President Obama's achievements. I put that a little bit in scare quotes. Lots of these achievements. Government is just the word for those things we choose to do together. That has never been the American conception. Voluntarism is the definition of America because it gets at our wills and our souls. And the things that fully make us human are those things that we choose to do together because of loves, because of affections. And so Aristotle's definition of a friend is someone that's a part of my expansive self. I care about my wife's sufferings as if they are my own. My kids, when they experience joy, that is my own joy. And so to end on a bit of a higher note, one of the greatest things President Obama has ever said when he celebrated what he defined as his most important office, his most important role, is as father to Sasha and Malia. He said, we have to, as a society, recover the sense that what makes you a man is not your ability to impregnate somebody. What makes you a man is the willingness to have the courage to share in the raising of that child. And that is a true Aristotelian, I would say Madisonian, Tocquevillian conception of what it is to be fully human, which is the voluntarist aspects of those things that we choose to do make us fully human. And we have a crisis in America when we can't distinguish between the meaning of America, which is so much broader than the compulsory powers of the state. And I believe that the two parts of this movement must be united in protecting and preserving that entire ecosphere of all these voluntary institutions. And one of the most important things we can therefore do is protect things like the not-for-profit institutions that create this full flowering of humanity, where we come together in collective action, but in voluntary action. We are neither isolated individuals, nor are we people who are fully defined by the compulsory powers of the state. We are people because of the things we choose to do together, and that starts with and emanates from family. So thanks for having me. What can we talk about? Yeah, love to.
Questions? So raise your hand and wait for the mic.
Not to put you on the spot, but what can government do to maybe help with this family crisis?
Yeah, so I'll be honest, I am policy cautious. I don't know if that's the right term, but I'm new to this. I have never been a politician before, and I ran more than anything else because I think we have a crisis in being able to articulate a shared consensus of what America means. And so the great challenge we face in the decline of the family is that why it's a tragedy is because the state will rush in and fill these vacuums. When I say common enemies to the family and to a market economy, in both cases, the assumption is that you need central planners to define all of these things. And so I'm more Burkean than libertarian, but I am very worried about the ability to use state tools to restore things that the state has done a lot to destroy. And so I'm humble and cautious, and I think in a limited Q&A time, I won't name particular policy levers, but I will say that if we don't have a shared sense of what the unintended consequences can be, when government facilitates dependency, it doesn't solve any problems. And so every time the government acts, even as we act to try to restore some of what the state is harming with regard to families, we need to be sure there's not a second and third order effect that we're not yet seeing. I do think, obviously, so Hippocratic oath type do no harm around marriage penalties is one of the first things we have to have a national consensus on. And I really do believe this is a 80-20, 90-10 issue if we can articulate it clearly. So I don't want to start at policy fights that are 41-59 or 55-45 or 45-55 when what we need to have a shared consensus around is first the fact that the state cannot ever comfort you on your deathbed. And I think of, to maybe celebrate AEI for one more moment, I think of Charles Murray's great aphorisms about one of the basic purposes of government is to take the difficulty out of things that it's good to take the difficulty out of. And it turns out there are a lot of things that you don't precisely want to take the difficulty out of. I mean, you want to in the moment, but not in the form of character development. You don't want to be in the cornfields at 5:15 in the morning when you're 13 years old, but when you're 23, 33, and surely 73, you look back and you're really glad you were there. And so I think that government should take the difficulty out of walking home from the restaurant late at night. Government should not try to take the difficulty of my spouse and me having to wrestle with cleaning up our 4-year-old's puke at 2 in the morning. Because the reality is that bonds him to us to him, and us to one another. And government can't do that. And if it does, it harms us.
Where do you think your colleagues, and especially on the Democratic side, stand on? Where do you think your colleagues, especially on the Democratic side, stand on the idea of this being a serious problem, forgetting about how you solve it?
I'm dispositionally optimistic, but I have no real data to support it. I can't believe that many rooted, grounded, stable people believe that the facilitation of easier transfer payments to flood into all the vacuums that the state is creating won't further exacerbate this problem. I can't understand how stable adults can see the world that way and think wherever there's a problem, if we just throw more money at it, that will inevitably make it better. I think it's pretty obvious that in many cases that makes it worse. Here we could do something that's much more longitudinal than just America. You can go back to 15th, 16th, 17th century England, where people knew their fourth cousins and they knew their sixth cousins, and they know the differential requirements in terms of regional social insurance in those environments, right? We know that the decline of extended family and kin networks is really dangerous. And yet we're accelerating those kinds of trends, but we do it by trying to help people in the moment in ways that harm it in the long term. To me, that's obvious, and many of those folks should believe that, but I do think there is now an institutionalization of entitlement politics that say anything you can talk about, you can think about the Democratic presidential debate the other night, was there a problem that the answer wasn't make more things free? As a former college president, I'll say making more of 18 to 22-year-old perpetuation of adolescence with no accountability for the decisions you make, whether you learn while you're there, what you study, that's not the problem, right? That's the lack of free is not the real problem in higher education right now. And yet the rhetoric is such that it's really easy to be for free. And so I think that there is an entitlement mentality that's good politics, that's bad policy, and I hope not intellectually serious, but I don't have data to support that. 2 to go.
So maybe to follow up on that answer and the first question, there are voluntary institutions like churches, like universities, like schools that for many successful folks brought us to where we are, but those institutions are struggling. Are there kind of innovative voluntary institutions that you saw maybe as a college president or you're seeing at the level you're at now that are promising in terms of building that long-term capital versus addressing short-term problems?
I'm glad that we said before your question that we were going to take 2 more, because there's not a lot to say right now that's positive about civil society mediating institutions in America. I mean, I think one of the most basic things that's happening is we are hollowing out so many of these sectors. When we say private sector, people hear Koch brothers, right? They hear things that have been turned into demonization terms. And what people need to hear and what we need to educate them on is America has always been about the private sector, but private sector is that broad litany of Tocquevillian institutions. When Alexis de Tocqueville comes here and tries to make sense of America in the 1830s, because we finally win the revolution in the minds of Brits after the sequel. The War of 1812 is the sort of playing out of the rest of a revolution they thought these crazy people living on the frontiers of the earth never fully won 25 years before. And by 1830, we have the market revolution and the canal revolution. So many aspects of market and transportation revolutions coming into being. And so where did Tocqueville go to make sense of America? He goes to Washington, D.C., because if you're successful, you must have the best bureaucrats. And he gets to Washington and he finds that it's a swamp. It's uninhabitable most of the year. And so he goes out and tries to find the meaning of America. And there are 25 states at this point, and he goes to 17 or 18 of the 25, and he says, I found the meaning of America, and it is the Rotary Club. Right? And it is all of these things that are not isolated individualism, but are not compulsory institutions. It's voluntary society. And if you tried to say, what is the 2015 incarnation of the Rotary Club? It's much easier to think of institutional subsector after subsector that's withering right now. And it's one of the reasons that our national conversation sounds so overly partisan. We sound like such a polarized society. I actually think we're much more disengaged than we are polarized. But we sound that way because every conversation has to be national, because these local institutions are withering. And it's one reason to compliment the really important work that all of you, or many of you in this room, are spending your lives and callings doing. We need to reinforce that ecosphere, and a lot of that right now needs to be about defending the potential of new social entrepreneurship, and that needs to be by defending things like legal status and not-for-profit structure of religious institutions, regardless of PC moments that could be at play. Can we finish there?
What are your concerns, if you have any, about things like outside forces like student loans that slows down the establishment of new families? And if families are able to come together, that, I mean, it adds an extra strain of like financial concern.
Unpack a little bit more the tie to student loans, because I wasn't meaning to go hard to education, but if you are, tell me more what you mean.
Just like the student loans at high interest rates that, like, I know for myself I'll be paying probably till I'm 30 or 40. To see what do you have concerns about how that will have an effect on establishing families, like buying a house or owning a car or something like that?
So I guess I would put that in the context of the transformation of work and the pace with which people are going to cycle through jobs for the rest of their existences. And I think the real problem we face with so much family formation right now, that's a much larger problem than just the post-2008 economic downturn, which is what's easy to focus on. The macro problem we face is that we don't have a shared understanding of the problem of going from large tool economies to an IT knowledge and service economy, right? I mean, from the beginning of human history, there have only been 4 kinds of economics, really. Hunter-gatherers, rural villages around agrarian communities, industrialization or big tool economies, and whatever we're entering now. We don't know anything about the transition from hunter-gatherers to agrarian civilization because we didn't have alphabets, right? But we know a lot about the disruption of villagers becoming urban city dwellers and having to take factory jobs for the first time. 1870 to 1940 was one of the most disruptive moments in human history. And yet, once you got to the city, it turned out all these 15 to 24-year-old males, which are really scary forces anywhere on earth, roaming the countryside. As these 15 to 24-year-old males get to cities, once they get a job, turns out they have that job at that firm basically until retirement or death. What we're entering now is everything people were scared about from 1870 to 1940, except it's forever. Average duration at a firm in the late 1970s was still 26 years. Today, average duration at a firm is 3.5 years. We've made lots of progress with 401ks to create portability around pension and retirement plans. We couldn't even have a rational debate during the healthcare reform debates of, at least Senators Obama and Clinton had meaningful debate in their primary in 2008. Ironically, Obama wins and we got Mrs. Clinton's health plan. The best attack ads that should have been run against Obamacare were Obama's own words when he was criticizing Hillary Clinton's plans in their primary. But the reality is pre-existing medical conditions, a big deal for the 4 million people that have them. We should have lots of human empathy, but let's right-size this problem. It's 1 1/3% of the population, whereas 25% of Americans pass through a period of uninsurance every year. You go through 4 to 6 months of structural uninsurance every third year when you change jobs. That problem, now taken to human capital at job retraining, is what higher education is going to become about over time. And the real question is, will there be a flowering of diverse institutions? Will accreditation cartels be broken down so you can have supply-side innovators? Or will the government come in and say, we're going to define free, but we're also going to centrally plan these institutions? That won't work. Because even today, we have this idealized picture of 18 to 22-year-olds at residential liberal arts colleges or universities that have a great football team and Saturday afternoon experience. They're working full-time as students. They're studying some liberal arts discipline. You know how many people fit that profile out of all students in higher ed? 18%. 82% of the students in higher education are a 28-year-old single mom who goes to school part-time, works full-time. She's on her 3rd discipline, and she's at her 4th institution trying to cobble together all of the different credits from different institutions to put together a degree. That's not idyllic, but it is reality. And the fact is people are going to go through higher ed institutions for the rest of their life, and we've not had any discussion about what the new Homestead Act looks like. We don't have any theory of what it means to create people and give them the human capital potential to be lifelong learners. And so clearly family formation in the 20-something cohort is going to break down when you're going to have a job for 3 years and you have no long-term human capital investment plan. On that happy note, thanks for having me.
Are we coming up?
Good morning and welcome to the opening session for the conference on Strong Families, Prosperous States at AEI. My name is Aparna Mathur and I'm a resident scholar in economic policy studies here at AEI. We apologize for the late start, but we are so grateful to Senator Sasse for coming and offering his views and opinions to us. The topic of discussion for our first panel is the role of family structure in influencing macroeconomic outcomes such as economic growth, child poverty, median family incomes, and inequality when measured at the state or national level. To my knowledge, this direct link between family structures and economic growth has been largely unstudied. For example, when we look at the papers that have studied economic growth, a huge focus has been on technology, and changes in technology have defined periods of high and slow growth. Economist Roger Gordon has written extensively about the process of economic growth, and he links it to 3 industrial revolutions, linking them closely to the steam engines, then electricity, then changes in communications, marketing, and finally with computers and the internet. However, in his most recent writing, he suggests that even if the US were to stay innovative in the future, US growth could be weaker because of factors such as lack of education, rising inequality, and changing demographics. So this suggests that if there are linkages between family structures and factors like human capital investments, child poverty, and inequality, it is extremely important to study and explore them if we really want to sustain economic growth in the US. Fortunately, we already know a lot about the role of family structure in influencing these outcomes. We know from Brad and Robert's earlier work that there has been a decline in the traditional 2-parent family, and this change in structure is correlated with changes in median family income and also inequality. For instance, between 1980 and 2012, they show that among married parent families, median family income rose 30%, while for unmarried parents, family incomes rose only 14%. Inequality widened considerably more within unmarried parent families than in married parent families. Their work also suggests that lower labor force participation rates for men are correlated with the retreat from marriage. Other research has shown that single mother families typically live in high rates of poverty, and also children growing up in these families are more likely to be in poverty. Also, growing up with both parents is associated with a 15 percentage point lower probability of dropping out of high school. So we know that there are linkages between family structure and these different outcomes, such as inequality, labor force participation, investments in education. But is family structure really now starting to play a causal, or at least become a significant correlate of economic growth when measured at the state or national level? To discuss this, we have an excellent lineup of speakers. We will begin with Bob Lerman and Joe Price, who will comment on how economists have largely overlooked the links between family structure and macroeconomic outcomes, and they will discuss their latest report. We will next turn to Mitch Pearlstein, Elizabeth Jacobs, and Megan McArdle, who will each have 5 minutes to offer their own take and opinions on the report's key findings. And we will then engage in a Q&A where we encourage you to ask your questions and offer your opinions. So let me quickly introduce our speakers. You will find their longer bios in the folder. Bob Lerman is an Institute Fellow in the Center on Labor, Human Services, and Population at the Urban Institute, as well as Professor of Economics at American University and a Research Fellow at ISA in Bonn, Germany. He's a leading expert in apprenticeship, and he recently established the American Institute for Innovative Apprenticeship. Joseph Price is an associate professor of economics at Brigham Young University, specializing in family, education, health, and behavioral economics. His research has examined various ways to promote positive behaviors in children, issues related to parental investments in children, and the use of sports data to identify various behavioral biases. Mitch Pearlstein is founder and president of Center of the American Experiment, a nonpartisan public policy and educational institution which brings conservative and free market ideas to bear on the hardest problems facing Minnesota and the nation. Elizabeth Jacobs is senior director for policy and academic programs at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Her research focuses on economic inequality and mobility, family economic security, poverty, employment, social policy, social insurance, and the politics of inequality. And Megan McArdle is a Bloomberg View columnist who writes on economics, business, and public policy. She is the author of The Upside of Down. Megan previously wrote for Newsweek, The Daily Beast, The Atlantic, and The Economist. So we welcome all of you, and let's start with Robert and Joe.
Very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at one of the intermediating institutions that Senator Sasse talked about, and to be a part of a different intermediating institution. I'm sure that my family background encouraged me to study the family. I'm one of 10 children, and had a wonderful father. And so when I started looking at fatherhood, I was inspired by his example. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about, just set the stage, and Joe's going to do the hard work of showing our empirical approach and many of the findings. But I just wanted to reinforce the comment that there have been a number of studies, if you look in the literature, and I really wasn't aware of this until I started looking at this, and I want to also thank Brad Wilcox for inspiring this effort and working on this effort and heading this effort. But that pushed me to look a little bit at the literature on the determinants of state economic growth and the differences across states. And what I found was this, that there were studies, and most of these studies focused on a few examples. Interestingly enough, not too many of them dealt with the technological element, which maybe because that's considered more national. But look at all of these factors that studies have focused on. Now, in not one of these studies was family structure included, even as a separate control variable, independent variable. So that's one point. The second point is this State of the States report from the Poverty and Inequality. It's called the Poverty and Inequality Report from the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality. It's got chapters on labor markets, on poverty. These are differences across states, on income inequality, spatial segregation, safety net, education, health. The mobility one mentions family structure, but basically there's no separate analysis of state differences in family structure, which is kind of stunning if you're looking across states at things that are quite important, nothing on, even on child support or any kind of institutional element that relates to the family, other than perhaps you could say the safety net aspect, but again, not really directly. Now, this is a scatter plot. It's not in the report, but this is just a scatter plot. And again, I thank Joe for providing the data on state poverty and how it varies, poverty rates, child poverty rates, and how it varies with married parenthood, share of married parents. I mean, just look at that. You can't look at that without seeing at least a very strong association. Turns out the R squared is about 0.45. It explains about 45% of the variance. Explains in econometric terms, not in necessarily causal terms. But nonetheless, when you look at that, it jumps out at you that if you're interested in state variations, you may want to look at this problem. So that's why we did it, and Joe's going to tell us how we did it.
So it is very interesting that of all the work showing that married adults earn more, work more, are more productive, that we almost never look at this at the state level. And that of all the research that's looked at all the factors that contribute to state level economic growth, the family is just never part of the conversation, never part of the regression. And so our contribution here is to really think carefully about how does the strength of families within a state contribute to the economic growth of the state. And to do this, we put together a state level panel over 35 years, going from 1977 to 2012. And we wanted to think carefully about what are the measures we care about. What does it mean to have a good economic outcome as a state? And as an economist, like the standard go-to is the state per capita GDP. Okay, and we measure per capita GDP at the country level in all of our growth regressions. We can do this at the state level as well. And we think that's an incredibly important measure of economic growth, but there's other things we care about. We care about median family income. We care about the number of children that are living in poverty. And we care about the degree to which kids can rise out of poverty. So in our analysis, we're going to use all four of these measures, and what we're going to see is we're going to see if the family plays a role in these things that we really care about. And then you need to think about, well, how do you measure family strength? How do you measure the role of marriage in a state economy? And so the two measures we're going to use is the fraction of adults aged 25 through 59 that are married. And then, because we care about children, we're also going to look at the fraction of parents in that same age group who are married. And I think just at a personal level, when we're thinking about these economic outcomes, I think all of us can think about the degree to which our family life affects our work life. And probably the easiest way to think about it is to imagine what happens when your spouse has to go away for a couple weeks and leaves you at home with the children. And ask yourself, does that affect your ability to work? Does it affect your productivity? And you start to then realize kind of the challenges that a single parent's going to face in navigating these two important domains of their life. And so I think what we're doing is taking this natural intuition that happens to us at the household level and saying, does this aggregate up to the state level? Is this something that a governor should care about? And naturally, we want to also control for other things that might differ across states. So we're going to control for the age distribution, the race, the education, and we're going to include, the standard measures that might contribute to economic growth, such as urbanization, female labor force participation, state expenditures on higher education, on highways, tax policy. Now, one thing we should be clear is that actually these extra controls, while important to put in, like the results are incredibly robust to taking some of these out. So if you feel uncomfortable about us having the minimum wage control in there, the fact is if we take it out, it doesn't change the results. Or if you're concerned about some of those others, the results are very robust. We're including those because I think it's a pretty standard practice to try to control for other things that might affect the outcome. Now, in terms of the analysis, what we're using is a state year panel. And what this allows us to do is exploit variation within a state in changes in the fraction of adults that are married, or the change in the fraction of parents who are married. So this little figure over to the right, which is probably too small to see, is meant to illustrate the fact that some states have experienced an incredible change over the last 35 years. Kentucky's seen a 40% decline in the fraction of adults who are married. Okay? In contrast, you have other states like California or Utah that have had a smaller change over time. So there's actually, the nice thing, this is a bad thing for the states that have seen a major decline, But from an econometric perspective, this is really nice. It gives us a lot of variation in which to look at changes over time in these states. So the way to think, this is another scattered plot that, again, you can see in the report, but it shows you the kind of two sources of variation. Now, one is that there's a lot of change over time within particular states, and the other is the fact that states also at a point in time differ incredibly in how much, how the fraction of adults that are married. Now, just to kind of help you understand the results I'm going to show you here in just a second, the variation that we're exploiting is this variation within a state. So if we think about Nebraska, what we're asking is if Nebraska experiences a reduction in the fraction of adults who are married, what's going to happen to the economic outcomes in Nebraska? So let me show you a couple of the results. The full set of results are in the report, but let me just kind of narrow in on one. So this is, again, this is a state-level regression. And I'm going to talk geeky for a second, use standard deviations, but then I'm going to translate it into more people talk here in just a second. But what this says, that coefficient right there that I've circled, the $351, is it says that if you experience a standard deviation increase in the fraction of adults that are married, that's about a 6 percentage point increase. So think about, a state that moves from, 66% of the adults that are married to 72%. They're going to experience an extra $351 in per capita GDP. Okay, that's about $1,400 for a family of 4. Now, if we look at a different measure, which is the fraction of parents who are married, then we see an even larger effect. Okay, again, a standard deviation increase in that measure, which is about 4 percentage points. You'll see in that bottom number that per capita GDP increases by about $773. Okay, now this is just in terms of standard deviations. This is the way that an economist would think about interpreting the numbers. Let me just kind of put this into kind of real people talk. And then some of the other measures that we look at is upward mobility. And the way we think about upward mobility is you take kids that are born to parents at the 25th percentile in the income distribution, and you ask how far up the income distribution will that kid be when they're an adult. And we find that if you increase the fraction of adults that are married, that actually kids will have a better chance at moving up in the income distribution. You'll also see a dramatic reduction in child poverty and an increase in median family income. So these are all in terms of a standard deviation increase. Another way we could do this is just say, hey, let's compare states that are at the top quintile to states that are at the bottom quintile. So what I'm going to do is just show you these same 4 outcomes again. And the comparison we're going to focus on is on the right. And one of those bars is for a state that's in the top quintile in terms of the fraction of parents who are married. The other is the states that are in the bottom quintile. And you can see kind of the magnitude of the differences. Okay, so right here on the right, so that green bar are these top quintile states. And this is per capita GDP. It's $46,000, 216. And then if you look at the families that are in the bottom quintile, it's $44,765. So this is a difference of about $1,400. Now, if we look at upward mobility, again, this is what happens to kids that are born at the 25th percentile. How far up do they move? And you'll see that in these states that have a really strong culture of marriage among parents, they're going to move up to the 46th, almost 47th percentile, whereas the kids that are in the bottom quintile states are only going to move up to the 42nd percentile. Another measure is child poverty. Okay, so in these states that have strong marriage culture among parents, you'll see that the poverty rate's about 19%, and that in the about 20%, and then in the bottom quintile states, it's about 22%. And then finally, in terms of median household income, you see a difference of about $3,600. Okay, so these are numbers that actually matter. These are numbers that would make a big difference for individual families. And I think that in all of our efforts to look at things at the individual level, I think that when we aggregate things up to the state level, you start to see that this could really, that a culture of marriage can actually have a big effect on the economic growth of an individual state. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Bob.
Final 2 points. One is we looked at the role of married parents in comparison to some of the other factors that people think are quite important. And what you see is, generally speaking, the effect of marriage exceeds that in most of the regressions, exceeds that even of the share of college educated. And in terms of race differences, married parenthood has a huge impact even relative to that. Now, I just to conclude briefly, these estimates, they reveal only part of the family structure effect. Because as Joe said, in some ways, we're going from 66 to 70, or 66 to 72. So it's not going from 50 to 80. Okay, the numbers may seem a little small because we're comparing these changes. But one thing I wanted to point out is this point about the national changes in family structure. We're even abstracting from that because we have year effects that incorporate those national trends. So the decline overall in the nation, in a sense, we're kind of excluding that. We're looking at within states abstracting from these national trends. We don't incorporate initial state differences either. So states that start out with very low shares of married parents, for example, we're saying, oh, we're not counting that. We're not counting that, even though that may have a long-term effect. And even with all of that, we still get highly significant effects. So our conclusion is that it's time to take these family variables far more seriously, both for studies of economic growth and of economic well-being more generally, and for public policy. And later, I don't know, we'll talk a little bit about policy. Thank you.
And thank you. Great pleasure to be here. I am not surprised. I'm disappointed, but I'm not surprised that there have not been studies along these lines in the past. And without restricting my lament to questions of political correctness, the fact is lots and lots of academics don't want to touch anything about families. They don't want to touch anything about marriage. It can get dicey in terms of questions of race and being judgmental and not adequately respecting diversity and so forth. So it doesn't surprise me. A variation on the theme, Senator Sasse mentioned some very good comments by President Obama about being a father. Some of you may remember his appearance at a black church during the 2008 campaign. It was Father's Day, and he gave an absolutely wonderful sermon/campaign speech about the importance of fathers. Never once, however, did he mention the word marriage or married, and that is absolutely a consistent theme in much of this field, as you know. In terms of the analysis, makes perfect sense to me. I'm not an econometrician, don't play one on television either, but if anything, I would suggest, I would think, at least I assumed, that the differences between married and unmarried situations would be even more severe. I wonder if, you can tell me if when doing this it ever occurred to you, and this is not meant as a criticism of the study certainly, but this is a classic example of defining deviancy down. Because I'm from Minnesota, and Brad Wilcox wants me to talk about Minnesota, which I'll do in a second, but we rate real well on this. We come out number 3 on some stuff and number 6, I think, on something else, but our out-of-wedlock birth rates are much higher than they were for the country as a whole half century ago, which I suspect is a long time now. We are defining deviancy down. If I have another question about the interpretation of the study, it has to do with how the results, at least in my state, and we are wonderful, where we top just about every list, though I have to tell you, a colleague of mine, a counterpart at the progressive think tank in Minnesota, Growth and Justice, they released a report several years ago that said when it comes to educational achievement, if the racial makeup of Minnesota was comparable to that of the country as a whole, our educational achievement, K-12, would resemble Arkansas, Alabama, and South Carolina. So we are good, but we're not necessarily that good. But the broader point I want to make here is that in the city of Minneapolis, in the county of Hennepin, in St. Paul, and in Ramsey County, there are communities doing dreadfully. The African American community in Minneapolis has an out-of-wedlock birth rate in the mid-80s, and it's similar in St. Paul. And the achievement gaps, educational achievement gaps, between students of color and white students in the Twin Cities may well be the biggest in the United States. So on the whole, at the macro level, Minnesota is doing wonderfully. In terms of many communities, various communities, they are not. And I have a particular interest, I've been writing about it for a number of years now, about deepening class divisions in our nation, a theme and a concern shared by everybody in this room. And I can't imagine a situation more vivid than what we have in Minnesota about the state as a whole doing very well, but individual communities quite often doing terribly. We have work to do.
Well, thank you all. Thanks for this report. I was here, I think it was about a year ago, for what was sort of the first chapter of this report, so I'm really pleased to be back and looking at the macro level. And I encourage you to read Brad and Bob's paper from last year looking at the family structure economy connection. And my comments are actually going to be mostly focused on that. So I have 3 points. One is kind of a big picture economic macro models comment. The second is a kind of wonky point about causal direction, and the third is just some reflections on policy. So for the macro question, I mean, this is, I think, a fantastic way of really putting families in the center of our thinking about what makes the economy grow. The economy is not a firm. That's something that I think if you listen to, the economic news or read the newspaper, sometimes it seems like the economy is basically about firms and firm interactions, but anyone who actually exists in the economy every day knows that the economy is about people. It's about people aggregated into families, and I really appreciate this focus on that. And the paper says this, but I think it's worth just reflecting for a minute on why families are so important for understanding the way that the economy works and grows. And there are demand-side channels, so the idea of pooled incomes and earnings means that people in a family unit have potentially more money to spend. There are supply-side channels. The easiest one to think about is the human capital development for kids. So really just from a theoretical framework, I want to applaud you guys for putting that out there, and I hope that people will really continue to take that approach seriously and think about the implications for what it means for research and what it means for policy. My second point is about the direction of the causal arrow and what way we can sort of understand whether family structure impacts economic outcomes, whether on a micro or a macro level. It's really difficult to identify what direction the cause flows. So is it about family structure impacting economic outcomes, or is it about economic supports allow people to form stable, secure families, which in turn feed back into those positive economic outcomes? And today's study, I'm sure that I can see you guys taking notes, so I'm very interested to hear your responses. But in my view, today's study shows us there are really strong correlations between marriage rates and a variety of key economic outcomes. That's pretty uncontroversial. It's in there. It's very clear in the work. But in the absence of a real exogenous shock allowing us to isolate the impact of marriage on economic outcomes, the question of whether marriage causes economic outcomes or whether it's economic factors that are supporting families that are in turn causing those economic outcomes is pretty open. Now, I should say I don't have a problem with an imperfect causal design. I think actually one of the problems with economics today is that this obsession with like perfect causal identification, and it means that in a lot of economics, you can't actually ask interesting questions because you don't have the perfect methodology, and therefore the important questions don't get asked. So I don't actually have a problem with that at all. I think you need a compelling theoretical story and kind of a backup common sense history to back up the story that you're telling, and I think the authors do a great job of that. So I'll sort of take that as a given. But what I wanted to do with the remainder of my time is to spell out some of the research suggesting that the causal arrow might also go the other way. And I don't actually think it's impossible to have both sides of those things right. Because, I mean, it just intuition. I think anyone here who has a family can say that there's a vicious or virtuous circle, depending on which direction it's going, between family structure and economic outcomes, and sort of keeps on going around and around. Which has some implications for policy, which I may or may not have time to get to, mostly because I just want to get out there some of what I think is the most compelling work showing that economic outcomes can have an impact on family structure. So the first one is a book that some of you may be familiar with. If you're not, I recommend it, that came out, I think, last fall from Andy Cherlin at Hopkins, called Labor's Love Lost. And what Andy does is look at marriage over the long arc of time. And so we see class gaps in marriage. We've seen kind of the decline in marriage has largely been because lower income people aren't getting married at the same rate. The change has been particularly dramatic for white people as opposed to African Americans. And what Andy's book shows is that those class gaps aren't new, that we saw the same patterns, high marriage rates among better educated, high socioeconomic status white men versus lower status white men in the late 1800s in the US, which was a period that looked very similar to the economic situation that we've been in from the 1980s through the present with rising inequality. And that what happened over the time when the economy improved between after World War II, wages went up for men without college, marriage rates went up for men without college, and as the economy has stagnated for lower economic status people, particularly men, marriage rates have fallen as well. So that's kind of data point one. Two is from Kathy Eden's interviews. So she's also at Hopkins, and Andy uses the long arc of census data. Kathy's gone out and talked to lots and lots of people, low-income people, to understand how they think about marriage. And this gets at the question of whether this is like a cultural norms issue or not. And what she finds from talking to many, many people is that low-income people see two prerequisites for marriage. One, financially stable men, and two, economically independent women. These should be pretty familiar, I think, to anyone who's better educated, right? I think that most of us in the same room want the same thing, but it's a lot easier to accomplish that if you're a better educated person with opportunity in the economy than it is if you have virtually no opportunity in the economy, right? Like you've got a well-educated second earner, you can find that person. It's a lot harder to do if opportunities are fewer for you in the economy. It also suggests that the risk of a bad marriage or divorce are greater than the threat of being single, particularly for lower income women, which is, I think, an interesting and important point to keep in mind. And the last point, sort of a data point that I'll put out there, is Danny Schneider and Adam Reich. Danny Schneider is a sociologist at the University of California, Berkeley, who's doing really great work on kind of the family structure, economic opportunity nexus. His research shows that young men who join a union are more likely to marry soon after than similarly situated. He uses a design that lets it be basically union elections, people who voted to join versus not. It's a nice design. And lest you think that this is just a sneaky plug for unions, the impact of the union membership actually disappears once you account for the increase in wages and job security that come with unionization for those workers. And so say what you will about whether or not unions is policy or what you want to see. What we do know from his research is that what it is about the union is the economic opportunity and security that unionization affords for these men, in turn supports marriage and stable families. So those are just a handful of data points suggesting that the economic piece matters for creating the stable families piece, and just to encourage us to not lose track of the fact that the causal arrow, I think, probably goes in both ways, and that there's some really great data building the case for that piece. I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about policy, but the one last thing that I would put out there is that we have data on state-sponsored efforts at marriage promotion, and we know that it hasn't worked particularly well. We have data on a program called building strong families. It found no effect on program participation on relationship quality, relationship outcomes, or the probability of marriage. I'd also note that not everyone wants to get married. Many people who do want to get married just are unlucky and don't find the person that they want to marry. So thinking about policies, if we know that promoting strong economic opportunity for people and economic security has positive outcomes beyond just promoting stable families, that seems like a good place to start. So in my view, the emphasis on sort of focusing on the direction that economic opportunity can have on stable families could have other positive spillover effects, and that seems like generally a good thing. So I will leave it at that, and hopefully we'll have more time to talk policy in the discussion. Thanks.
Hi, since I'm the journalist and have no technical qualifications whatsoever, I'm going to engage in the classic example of speculating wildly. And so I view my role in this panel as, first of all, talking about some of the why, but also the inevitable section in every book or article that a journalist writes, which is the what is to be done section. And the why, I think that I'm so glad that we're talking about this because, in fact, there's this really interesting phenomenon on certain topics in economics where I feel like economists' brains just fall straight out of their head and they start saying things that make no sense in any other context. So, like with healthcare, you'll hear economists ranting about Me Too drugs and with pharmaceuticals. Well, in what other industry are we like, I wish we didn't have so much competition, right? And similarly with the family, what's fascinating to me is when you talk to economists who say it's all selection effect, right? Because it's hard to tease out causation with this stuff. And so often what economists will say is, well, it's obviously selection effect. You've got the high quality people who are stable, they have good jobs, they're conscientious, they're educated and so forth. Those people have an easier time forming families. But then you talk about education, which is basically exactly the same debate. And they're like, well, obviously education is very valuable. I mean, obviously journalism is very valuable too, right? And whatever pays your paycheck is. But I think that there's a story for both, right? I think that there's a story where some of it is going to be selection effect. If it is easier to get married when you are a high income person with a stable job, then those people are going to show up as, and indeed in a country where people are so mobile, right, where people are moving to states that offer the kind of life they want, people who are forming stable families and very interested in, say, a school district that is filled with the children of other stable families, what you're going to see is migration patterns towards that. And the people who get left behind may be the people who are less interested or less able to do that. But there's also obviously a story, and again, this is where economists, specialization, right? It's very important, gains from trade. When you have two people, you're specializing, you're increasing the productivity of your household in a way that you are not with just one person. And so it seems obvious to me that probably there's almost certainly some mechanism simply because of the stuff that people observe. We don't even have children. When one of us goes away for a week with a dog, it's like my whole life starts revolving around, has he had his walk? We need to do his ears. Where there's two people, and so that is that's the why I think that we don't know, but I think there's certainly a strong argument for this. And I think that often on the family, we're engaged in what philosopher Robert Nozick dubbed normative sociology, which is the study of what the causes of things ought to be. And so, the causes of things ought to be things that are very amenable to policy, that fit in with the political, ideological preferences of the median person in the academy, which aren't going to trigger a lot of angry letters from activist groups and so forth. And I think that has stunted the study of the family in an unfortunate way, and its effect on economics. The what is to be done section, however, is hard, right? And this is actually, I think that this is right, is that jawboning people about getting married doesn't seem to work very well. On the other hand, there's, as a sociologist of my acquaintance recently tweeted, people say, well, marriage is too hard to fix, so let's fix poverty, which we know is easy, right? In fact, poverty is also really hard to fix, and giving people money is does not have a fantastic history of lifting people out in the kind of linear way that you would expect. Giving someone, the evidence from lottery winners and so forth is that straight fiscal transfers have more complicated effects than we would expect if it were simply easy to move the money down the line and change behavior. And we're also seeing, as we see this move more towards the middle class and away from what used to be called the underclass in Canaletto's 83 book, that story is getting harder to tell, right? As the family formation problems move up and up the income ladder, you know, if you're making $60,000 a year and you have 2 kids, yes, your household budget is tight. But that isn't quite the same story as you know, the people Catherine Eden is interviewing. And as it moves further, the Catherine Eden story undoubtedly totally applies to the people that she's talking to. But how do I translate that into a massage therapist living in Phoenix who can't seem to form a stable family with the 2 different fathers of her children? And the other thing that I would say is that the fundamental problem, right, is economists call it the collective action problem. There's been a lot of spate of articles basically arguing, well, we can't do anything about marriage because lower income men are garbage. They sit around, they play video games, they're unreliable, they quit their jobs after 3 months. I am now paraphrasing. I am not saying lower income men are garbage. But there's this sort of, well, obviously these women can't get married because these men are basically a 4th child. And there's no, well, but you sort of have to ask, like, why are the men acting that way, right? You can't just sit at home and play video games and intermittently quit your job and have money and housing like fall from the ceiling periodically, right? Someone is paying for that person to have a game console. Either it is their parents or it is their girlfriend. Someone is enabling this behavior. And low-income jobs, certainly, they're undesirable, they're unstable. Like, I've written about all of these things. I think these are all problems. I think they're hard problems, but I think they're all problems that we should think about doing something about, especially the instability of work schedules. That said, my grandfather dropped out of high school because during the Great Depression, spent his year cleaning tons of rotted cabbage that went unsold out of the silo. Only ended up finishing high school because he wanted to play basketball. He had no interest in the academics. And worked as a grocery boy until he was 26. And it wasn't like this was back in the good old days when working as a grocery boy was really something you could support a family on. They moved into the spare bedroom in his parents' house. They literally cut a hole through the wall for their stovepipe. And that was where they set up, they paid rent. My grandmother put all the money into envelopes, and they had no money. They were dead broke. If you told anyone, if you wrote a New York Times story today about the young married couple who's living in a bedroom in their parents' house, they have cut a hole of an unventilated stove, right, going out of their window. They have 1 bathroom for 8 people. They live 8 miles from town. There is only 1 car for the entire family, and it breaks down a lot, and they really can't afford the gas to drive it, right? This would be like a Pulitzer Prize winning series on crushing poverty. My grandparents were middle-class people. They went to Rotary. My grandfather was a huge Rotarian. They went to Rotary. They never missed a week at church. So there is something beyond the simple material conditions that changes that. And part of it is what the culture around you accepts and what the women accept from the men in their lives. Right? It was not an option for my grandfather to say, I really don't like this job, I would like to quit it. My grandmother had a certain style she expected to be supported in, and he was going to deliver that. And so we have changed, right? We have changed the ability of women to say, no, I don't care if you don't like your job. You have to go. It's too bad. And we have also changed the expectation of the minimum. Now, maybe that's, there's the Adam Smith argument that, like, whatever the minimum is, that's kind of the decent thing that gets you respect, is the decent minimum, and that moves up as society gets richer. But you still have to ask, how is it? The jobs are not good at the bottom, and that is a problem. But there is also the fact of sort of serial quitting and so forth. It's on both sides. It is not simply, and part of that is what the local culture is supporting. What women will allow men to get away with is what they will get away with. That sounds terribly sexist, but I mean, it goes the other way. What men will allow women to get away with in a largely heterosexual society is what they will get away with. And that somehow we have changed those expectations in such a way that people don't feel marriage is possible, but they also don't feel expected to conform to this incredibly boring, horrible bourgeois norm that my grandparents did, right? They would drum you right out of the altar society if you did not show up at church every week. And so you had to go. And so I think we need a story that goes both ways, because obviously I think when you look at what goes on with the children's, human capital formation and the rest of it, it's obviously going to have huge knock-on effects, and it is something to worry about.
Great. Thank you all for your excellent presentations. Bob and Joe, do you want to respond to the panelists before we?
Yeah, I'll give a quick start. In terms of, one data point, as you put it, is the issue of what employers say is lacking in terms of people getting good jobs or even entry-level jobs. And many of the characteristics that they say are lacking have to do with things like motivation and showing up on time and a whole variety of things that really speak to the kinds of issues that Megan just described in terms of getting those jobs and keeping them. That said, I do believe, and we have something in the policy section on it, so I feel comfortable talking about it here, that we have over-academized the routes to career success, and that this is disadvantaging men, not just in the United States, but in many countries. The OECD has a recent report about it. The Economist has reported on this. It's not just a U.S. issue. And and that's why I started the American Institute for Innovative Apprenticeship, but one of the potentials there would be to widen the routes to career success that incorporate the differences that people have. In terms of the causation, I agree that it goes both ways. And in the work that I did with Avner Achituv, we had a very elaborate analysis that compared, again, people within themselves, how they were doing when married and when not married. And one of the most compelling elements was this issue of the impact of remarriage on earnings. Because here we're taking people, all of whom were divorced. Some of them got remarried, and some of them didn't. And it's not even the differences between them, but during the periods that they got remarried, they did better. So I do think there is a causal element to it. And then more broadly, in terms of the cultural area, I mean, I think that we have to, and it's a hard thing to analyze with pure econometric data, but you do see, very elaborate differences among people who have very similar job characteristics. And what's that all about? And a lot of it does have to do with the cultural milieu that we find ourselves in. And, one thing begets another. Now, I'll leave it at that.
So I really liked Elizabeth's comment that one of our failings as economists is we feel if we don't have a nice, tight research design that we don't even touch the question, which often pulls us away from some of the most important questions. And so I there's no doubt that this is going in both directions. That the thing is, in past research, it's much easier to change the economic status of individuals by either through state policies that change work opportunities or that change educational opportunities. We've never found that great policy experiment that dramatically changes, whether people marry. So I think that's a really important point. But it's fascinating that in our inability to answer a question using a gold standard, that we don't even try it using the best approaches we have available. And if you look at the state economic growth, they're putting in all sorts of variables in their models that are going to have the same problems as marriage, but they don't even think of the family as part of that equation. And then I really like Megan's comment about how the common comment among journalists that marriage is hard to fix, so let's focus on poverty. And I was asking Robert earlier about his experience working in New York as a commissioner. And the more you look at the data, and you can also see this in Putnam's book, Our Children, is that in all of these stories, the family's there. You see the poverty, and the family is always an integral part of these poverty issues. And yet no one wants to think of marriage as a part of the poverty reduction toolkit. And so I think it's almost like we're tying an important hand behind our back and then trying to fight with the tools that we think are readily available, and whereas the family has always been a source of social security, social support. And I liked what Senator Sasse said. It's the person that's there on your deathbed. And so, yeah.
I want to make one just very quick point about Elizabeth's comment about the marriage experiments, social experiments. It is true that building strong families had only an effect in one of something like 8 sites. But I think you have to think of these things as sort of the beginning of an effort. And, you know, if you said, well, there were a lot of kids that didn't learn how to read very well in first grade, so let's abandon first grade. You know, you wouldn't say that. You would say, well, this is an important thing for them to learn to read. Let's figure out why this isn't working. And I think that there are other studies of actual demonstrations and so on that are finding much more hopeful results. That said, I mean, I don't know that we can turn any of this around through individual individual interventions. But I think that it's too important not to try.
Mitch, did you? Okay.
Let me say something about religion. I love Kathy Eden's 2 books, Doing the Best I Can and Promises I Can Keep. But if you read it carefully, the number of times she refers to the role of religion or churches in the lives of the people she lived with and has written about, it's a small, small number. And when we talk about trying to do certain things with our hand or arm tied behind our back, I've been saying that, frankly, for a long time, that we need to find ways that are consistent with the Constitution, with civility, to take greater advantage of our religious institutions. I've never been of the mind that the wall separating church and state is as tall or as thick as some people make it out to be. In more practical terms, the wonderful Bill Raspberry was in Minnesota 20-some-odd years ago, and he was at an event, and a woman said, "Mr. Raspberry, how do you fix poverty?" And Bill said, "Oh, it's a good question." And he said, "It's such a big problem, you could jump in anywhere and make a contribution," and that his choice was to start with the boys. And that's precisely where I start, because many boys become the men that women don't want to marry, and for very good reasons. So how to make boys into men marriageable. And I think about education, and I think about kids with holes in their hearts where their fathers should be, or sometimes where their mothers should be, or sometimes where both parents should be. And I ask myself, what kind of education might work best for many of these kids? Not necessarily all, and not all. And I always come to a private school, frankly, and I'm exclusively the product of public schools throughout my life, a religious school, where kids can be nurtured a bit more, where a teacher can say, God wants you to succeed. It just might be more compelling for many young people. What am I talking about? I'm talking about vouchers. That was a roundabout way of talking about what I always talk about, vouchers. And by the way, I absolutely embrace apprenticeships. I will be doing more work on them. 2 of the things we should take greater advantage of.
Elizabeth, let me just open up for questions since we have a few minutes. Sure. Please wait for the mic and introduce yourself and then ask the question.
I'm Mona Charon. I'm a syndicated columnist. Thanks for a terrific panel. Very, very interesting. I'd like to pick up on, well, anyone can jump in on this. Discussing the causation issue is interesting, and I will confess that my bias was a little bit toward the family structure affecting poverty more than the economy affecting family structure, but I'm open to the possibility that it's the other way around. But so here's the question. We've been, the panel has so far discussed married families versus single parents. But what we see on the ground is that you don't exactly have single parents. You have cohabitation. And so women are not saying, that guy's a loser, he's not going to be in my life. He's in her life. He's in her house for a while. So if you would all just discuss the cohabitation thing, what's in the minds of these women who are willing to live with a guy and have a baby with him, but he's not good enough to marry?
Let's collect a couple of questions and get the panelists to answer them.
Hi, I'm Penny Starr with CNS News. My question is about same-sex marriage. Was that in your study? When you say marriage, are you referring specifically to any couple that's married or heterosexual couples that are married, and how that fits into this study?
We have one question there.
Hi, thank you so much for your remarks. I guess my question is along the lines of two things: the causation being really, really complicated and working both ways, and also the temptation that was mentioned earlier about not wanting to address maybe the real problem that's causing something if it's sort of inconvenient or politically incorrect, or maybe even if it's both a good force and a bad force. And so I'm wondering, A, what you think about this as a theory, and B, if you think it's possible to acknowledge that something might be causing something and not do anything about it or work to sort of reconcile it. So what I have in mind as far as the economic opportunity causing family structure disintegrate, it seems like the demands of the modern economy, as economists, you'd really want your workforce to be as mobile as possible. And I know that Megan McArdle mentioned that one of the things that was really keeping her grandfather's family in check was the demands of the community. And the degree to which an increasingly mobile and globalized workforce needs to be moving all over the country might cause communities to break down. And then the other thing is your grandmother's expectation for your grandfather was one thing that you mentioned was a real driving force in him showing up to work and doing what he needed to get done. But I'm wondering the degree to which that might be caused by the fact that she couldn't support herself. She really relied on him to be the means for her support. And so two really awesome forces in the modern age, feminism and globalization. Obviously, I'm big fan of feminism, and obviously here at AEI we're big fans of globalization because that might be what we think the main driver of getting most of the world out of poverty. But if those two things are very positive forces in some ways, could the issues that we're talking about today just be sort of unintended consequences or side effects of them? And if that's the case, is it possible for us to acknowledge that those forces are in many ways very, very good and sort of resist the urge to say, these are the causes of this, so we can only find causes of problems that we can sort of squash. But instead to say, maybe acknowledge that these are the side effects of these forces, and then instead of working to get rid of the root of the problems, work to sort of reconcile these problems, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Sorry for the long-winded question.
That's okay.
I have a two-word answer to what comes first, the chicken or the egg. Marble cakes. Everything swirls into everything else. I don't think we need to shy away from that. I would argue, though, that generally speaking, researchers have focused on the economy and those structural concerns causing a decrease in marriage as opposed to marriage causing economic deficits. But it's all there. It's a marble cake. Everything swirls into everything else.
Just on the last point, you might think that if there's instability or if there's unemployment, it would cause people to stay together. And in fact, I think cyclically you do see that when unemployment increases, there's actually less divorce. Divorce can be expensive, so and Mona, can you just remind me again? I'm sorry because this question.
Cohabitation.
Oh, cohabitation, yeah. Look, cohabitation gives you the same kind of economies of scale, and in some countries, it's not so bad. Although even in countries that have high cohabitation rates, I think marriage still, Brad will confirm this, high marriage rates still do better. But our cohabitation is a lot more tenuous, and we see a much faster breakdown, and then we have the multi-partner fertility issue that arises, all kinds of complications relating to child support. There was a recent piece about child support obligations going up during jail time and things of that sort. All of these complications begin to arise. And so while cohabitation, stable cohabitation could be okay, it tends not to be very stable in the U.S. However, it is the case that at the time of birth, there's a lot of cohabitation. So because there is a big distinction between non-marital births and births to single parents, meaning women living alone. A third factor is that very often women who live with their own parents, it's hard to see it in the data because the way the census handles it is they think of them as a separate family. But if you look at the entire household, in other words, if you look at households of single parents, there's a subset where poverty rates are not really that high, and it's because they're living with other family members.
Okay, Elizabeth and Megan, you have.
This is, I think, just reiterating what Bob was saying, and a slight tweak on it is I think it's really important to distinguish between family structure and family stability, right? And the difference between the U.S. and Sweden is that they have very high cohabitation rates, but they last for much longer. In many ways, they look a lot like our marriages do. And then there's the separate issue of family structure, whereas the point was just made that even in Sweden, you see marriage as a family structure different from cohabitation and has its own effects. So everywhere, kind of taking into account the fact that there's family structure and there's stability in family structures, and the structure of the family that's stable can vary, and really trying to get at understanding whether the outcomes that we see, economic and otherwise, whether those are coming from family stability or from family structure per se. And I think what we see in terms of and how we can think about policy interventions in some ways start to change a little bit if we think about promoting stable families regardless of what the structure is, and that allows you to think about a family being, an unmarried adult child and their aging parent who they're taking care of. That's a family. There are policy implications for what that multi-generational family might need on both ends of the spectrum, but it's very different than something would look like if you're just thinking about the structure per se.
Just one corrective there, that if you look at single parents, if you look at chronic poverty, people that are poor year after year, it's massively higher among single parents, even if they're stable single parents.
And stability also runs both ways. The marriage can be unstable, and among the Irish American community at the turn of the 20th century, there was like an epidemic of fathers abandoning their families and just moving to another city and starting over. And so, I would imagine it's both, but it definitely but. Anyway, so about mobility. Mobility is actually really high in the 19th century and the early 20th century in the United States. People are moving around. This has always been a historic pattern for me. The small town my mother grew up in is still there. I still have relatives there, and it looks like this breakdown of the lower middle class. People basically who don't have college degrees moving towards a pattern of unstable family formation where you're with the father for a few years, and then it doesn't work out. He had a job, and now he's lost it. And, it's everything, right? It's deindustrialization, although it's a rural area, so that's less of an issue. It's that there's the academic credentialism, I think, is a hugely underexplored things. There are people who are just not academic. And that doesn't mean my grandfather was one of them. He was a very successful small business owner for decades and made more money than anyone else in my family did after he got out of the spare room and the grocery delivery business. And that but he couldn't do that now because the expectation is that unless you can at least get through college, you're basically a worthless human being who should just spend the rest of your life popping chicken tenders in the deep fry at Popeyes. And I think this is ridiculous. We're requiring college degrees for things that don't need it. But we also just lack the kind of stable long-term jobs that people got into. The only jobs basically like that in that community anymore were the government. And the government the county government cannot employ everyone in the county. That's not a very efficient way to try to manage your tax base. And that means that there's absolutely all of this instability, but the community changed somehow. And so that has to be cultural mediation. There's no other variable that can explain why low-income men in the Great Depression have the same problems that they have now. Inequality is bad. They don't get married, but they also don't have children. So there's obviously just some intervening variable that is absolutely, it has to be culture. There's almost nothing else that could explain it.
Thank you. Joe, one quick response to the same-sex question.
Yeah, so let me answer Penny's question. So our data is going from 1977 to 2012, and our variable is the fraction of adults who are married. And that could certainly, econometrically, that could certainly include same-sex couples. We're using data from the current population survey, which is collected by the census. And one of the limitations of the census data historically has been that if a same-sex couple listed that they were married, the Census Bureau would actually uncode that. So that's just a technical issue that's been fixed since, but they haven't retroactively gone back and put the original responses back into the data. But there's not, in our definition, when you say fraction of married adults or the fraction of parents that are married or the fraction of adults that are married, it could certainly econometrically include them. Just on a technical issue, because of the way the Census Bureau did the data, it's not in this.
Follow up though, how would that influence the whole concept that if marriage is better for families and the economy? Wouldn't that bring a whole new?
Would certainly be an interesting thing to study. It's kind of a small number, and it's hard to study small numbers even in large data sets. But that would be something interesting for someone to look into.
Okay. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking our speakers. We'll start our next session in 5 minutes.
Yeah,
5 minutes.
There's 2 sessions. Yeah. Mitch, thanks so much.
Great pleasure.
I wrote down your book. I hadn't heard of
good.
it. I'm gonna.
and we will get started. So this has been a great morning already, and it's going to get even better with the next panel, which we have. As good. It's just going to fill out the whole day. Again, thank you all for being here, and I'm going to get right to introductions. The topic now is what do we do about it? And as a former state commissioner and city commissioner, it's very near and dear to my heart because these are tough issues, but you always have to find ways to move the needle. And we're going to go right in this order from Brad down the line to Ross. And I'm going to give very brief introductions of all of them and then let Brad take it away, and then each will comment. And I liked what Aparna did, gathering questions and then having them all come up to us at once. So Bradford Wilcox is a visiting scholar at AEI, where he directs the Home Economics Project. He is also a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. He is an associate professor of the Department of Sociology at the University of Virginia, where he directs the National Marriage Project, and he is one of the authors of the report we're discussing today. Next up is Ron Mincy, who is an old friend of mine, who I've worked with for very many years and is a great colleague and a great friend, who teaches at Columbia University and directs the Center for Research on Fathers, Children, and Family Well-Being. He's also a co-principal investigator of the Fragile Families and Child Well-Being Study and a faculty member of the Columbia Population Research Center. Before joining Columbia, he was at the Ford Foundation, where he served as a senior program officer and worked on such issues as improving social welfare policies for low-income fathers, especially child support and workforce development policies. We are very glad you're here, Ron. It's great to see you again. And then third is David Lapp, who is a research fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, an affiliate scholar at the Institute for American Values, and a co-investigator of the Love and Marriage in Middle America Project, a qualitative research inquiry into how working-class young adults form relationships and families. Mr. Lapp, it's great to have you as well. And then finally, last but not least, is Ross Stohat, who joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in April 2009. His column appears every Sunday. Previously, he was a senior editor at The Atlantic and a blogger for TheAtlantic.com. He's the author of Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, and Privilege, Harvard, and the Education of the Ruling Class, and a co-author with Raihan Salam of Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. We're very glad to have you here. And Brad, we'll start you off with the second topic today, which is how can federal, state, and civic policymakers strengthen families?
Thank you, Robert, for that gracious introduction. It's great to be here today to talk about our new report, Strong Families, Prosperous States. I want to begin my time this morning with you by briefly telling you a story. And it's a story about Doug Talby, actually someone that David Lapp here put me in touch with. And Doug was living in his parents' basement in Indiana, working on a minimum wage job in a factory. And in his own words, as we see here on the slide, he says, prior to getting married, I really didn't have a care in the world. He was pretty happy in his place at this job. But then he understood a woman, got married, and started having kids. And his whole perspective changed in the wake of that transition into marriage and fatherhood. In his own words, he said, quote, I had to step up and think about something besides myself and start taking care of them. And so what Doug did as he was transitioning into marriage and fatherhood was move into the Army and worked his way up the ranks and, of course, benefited from free health care and free housing for his wife and his kids. And it's clear in talking to Doug that his family situation was a motivating force in his strategic approach to the labor force. And then at a certain point realized that the sort of Army had a kind of a ceiling for him, and he transitioned again into working for a car dealership in Southern Ohio, where he's now directing their finance program, financing cars at this dealership. And he's now actually earning a six-figure salary. And this is a man, again, who doesn't have a college degree, living in Middle America and doing pretty well for himself, for his wife and for his kids. And to conclude about Doug, he said, quote, "It's my responsibility to work hard once I took the vows of marriage." So, of course, I'm offering him as an example, as a story that's emblematic of the way in which marriage and family life can play a key role in reorienting Americans' approach to work and the marketplace more generally. And as we're showing in this report today at the state level, in ways that tend to improve the economic health of the American states. So I want to kind of unpack this, this story here at the macro level this morning, and sort of explain why it is that we think that marriage matters, and explain the connections that we are finding here between strong families and prosperous states. And of course, just to sort of recap our story this morning, what we're finding is that when the family is strong, so too is the state economy, that state economic growth is higher, that state child poverty is lower, that state family median income is higher, and that the American dream itself is stronger. The poor kids in states with stronger families are more likely to rise up the economic ladder as adults, is part of the story here in this report. And if we look more particularly, for instance, at child poverty, we see that states that have high levels of unmarried parenthood, like New Mexico and Louisiana, for instance, these states also have much higher rates of child poverty. By contrast, states with low levels of unmarried parenthood or with stronger married parent families like North Dakota and New Hampshire are much less likely to have child poverty. And what we're finding in this study, again, is that there's a strong link here between family structure and child poverty, which this kind of ranking gives you a concrete illustration of. And the same story comes, too, again, to something like the American dream, looking at mobility for poor kids. Their odds of kind of making it into the middle class and higher are stronger in states like North Dakota and Utah, where the family is stronger, where there are more married parent families, than it is in the Carolinas. Kids born in North Carolina, kids born in South Carolina have a much lower chance of kind of making it into the middle class, making it to the upper class. In part, our report suggests, because there are fewer married parent families in their social milieu. So what's happening here? Why is there, again, this link between strong families and prosperous states? Well, part of the story we think that's going on here, that we hypothesize that's going on here, is a story that was told by George Akerlof, who, of course, is a Nobel laureate and the husband of our current Fed chair, in his essay in 1998 on men and families. And he wrote in that essay that, quote, "Men settle down when they get married," unquote. And that kind of perspective can seem a bit anachronistic today, for some even offensive. I had a comment on Twitter yesterday saying that women are offended by this idea that sort of marriage makes men more responsible or civilizes them. And I think the sort of the assumption there is it's women doing the work on the men. And that's really not necessarily my argument. My argument really is more as sort of the kind of men inhabiting this particular institution, this particular role of being a husband and father can be transformative for them. And what the research suggests is that when men get married, especially men who are married with their own kids, they are transformed by that experience. They work more hours. They work more strategically, less likely to be fired, for instance, compared to their equivalently credentialed peers. They're also less likely just to quit a job without having found a new job to transition into. And they work more successfully. Married men tend to enjoy an income premium compared to their single peers. So we think part of the story here, again, is that men who are in states where marriage is much more the norm are more likely to be engaged in the workforce. And we see at the cross-sectional level here that there's a strong link between being married with kids for men and being in the labor force. That they're about 13 percentage points more likely to be in the labor force compared to their male peers who are single and have no kids. But we also talked to you about the way in which what's called in Greek, and forgive my Greek here, the oikonomia, sort of the economics of the household, is different, right, for married families than it is for both cohabiting families and for single parents. that married families tend to enjoy greater economies of scale, more income pooling. They save at higher rates compared to their cohabiting and single peers. They also get more support from kin. Parents and in-laws are more likely to help their kids and their grandkids when their children are married. And as Bob pointed out earlier, we know too that people who get married before they have kids enjoy more stable families than those who are cohabiting or have kids as single parents. And that stability, of course, tends to foster better economic outcomes over time as well. And we see in the report, for instance, that even controlling for a wide range of factors, things like age, gender, and education of the household head, not surprisingly, that there's a kind of family income premium that married families enjoy compared to unmarried families in America. And this pattern obviously persists for African Americans, for Hispanics, for whites, for less educated, and for more educated Americans, as this slide here indicates. And then the third kind of hypothesis that we explore in the report is this idea that strong families help foster the accumulation of more human capital, both within individual families and then at the state level more generally. So we know, for instance, that kids from intact married families are more likely to graduate from high school and college, and they're more likely to be gainfully employed as young adults. And as Bob Lerman and I reported last year, they work more hours. Both men and women in their late 20s work more hours than their equivalent peers when they come from an intact married family. So the family is a kind of proving ground, or it helps to sort of be a seedbed, if you will, for the accumulation of human capital, which helps kids as they transition towards adulthood and even into adulthood. And then we find, of course, here that there's a similar story at the state level, that states that have more married parents, even controlling for a wide range of factors, including things like median family income, state levels of education, race, et cetera, that states with more married families have higher rates of high school graduation. So again, strong families help in the accumulation of human capital, even at the state level, our report suggests. These, we think, are some of the mechanisms here that help to explain why it is that strong families are linked to more prosperous states. And I itemize again the factors that I've just gone through. So given all this, why is it that the retreat from marriage, a retreat from marriage really that began in the 70s in important ways, has affected some states more than others? I think one of the striking things about this report is that, we think about kind of this sort of retreat from marriage happening kind of across the country in a kind of standard or uniform fashion. But one thing that's really clear in this report is it's not the case. Some states have been affected much more by this retreat from marriage than have other states. There are clearly major regional differences in play here. And what's going on here with that regional difference? And I think, one view that is articulated, I think, quite well on the left is that we can account for this retreat from marriage largely using an economic perspective. And when Annie Lauer was at the New York Times, she was kind of writing about these questions. And she said, from an economist's perspective, our collective allergy to matrimony might be a macroeconomic issue. And that is, in order to save marriage, we'd have to end poverty. So in more simple terms, she's basically saying it's the economy stupid. And so the idea here is that when the economy is doing poorly, people are less likely to get and stay married. And for, I think, obvious reasons to all of us here in this room. So that's part of the story here that's sort of articulated in reference to these different patterns of marriage, both by class and we're showing by state. But others would say not so fast. So Isabel Sahilo Brookings, for instance, has said that a purely economic theory falls short as an explanation of the dramatic transformation of family life in the US in recent decades. And others, like Robert Putnam, for instance, have pointed to the fact that during the Great Depression back in the 1930s, there was obviously a lot of poverty, a lot of economic distress. But there was no big increase in single parenthood, no big increase in divorce, okay? So that suggests to us that sort of the culture matters, the civic context matters in shaping family patterns and family stability, and not just the state of the economy. So in that spirit, in the report, what we show is that some states, states like South Carolina and Mississippi and Delaware and Kentucky, are more likely to have been hit hard by this retreat from marriage. Other states like Utah and Idaho and New Hampshire and Minnesota have been much more resistant to this retreat from marriage, much more resilient in the face of these family changes. And so given this sort of regional pattern, what does that suggest about arguments related to social structure and culture? Well, I think the regional patterns give some support to kind of the progressive line that social structure matters. We see that economics and education are clearly linked to resisting the retreat from marriage. So states like Kentucky, for instance, and Louisiana that have comparatively low levels of education and low levels of median income for men who don't have college degrees have been affected much more by the retreat from marriage than states like Minnesota and New Hampshire that have comparatively high levels of education and high levels of median income for men without college degrees. So these sets of findings in the data are, I think, supportive to an important extent of kind of a progressive take on all of this. But I also want to say here too, just as a kind of quick aside, but an important aside, that when we think about something like education, which is usually kind of deployed as a kind of progressive social structural factor in all this, it's important also to recognize that today there are major cultural differences between Americans by the educational attainment of adults and parents. So here we see that kids whose parents are better educated have pretty different attitudes about things like single parenthood, about things like the importance of attending college, and also are pretty different in terms of the odds of their parents being married. They also differ in meaningful ways by median family income. But I just want to say that we can't assume that education, when it's functioning well in our models, is just about economics. I think it's also pointing today to difference oftentimes in the cultural milieu, which then in turn has implications for marriage and family stability more generally. But then more directly on the cultural part of the story, if this is all about economics, that is, the shifts in family life in American society in our states in the last 50 years, last 40 years, we'd have a hard time, I think, accounting for the story in Idaho, Nebraska, and Utah, where they tend to have middling or lower levels of education and income, but have pretty high levels of married parenthood. So the experience that we've seen with these states suggests that culture matters here too. And I echo the words of David Leonhardt, the New York Times, who said in reference to all this that, quote, the respect, even reverence for the idea of marriage found in conservative communities may affect people's behavior and attitudes. And that's, I think, what the data suggests, particularly actually when you look at the county level. So the bottom line here is that our conclusion is that both structural and cultural factors explain why some states have proved to be more successful in resisting the nationwide retreat from marriage. And here on this map, you can see this quite clearly. States like Idaho and Utah on the left here, and states like New Hampshire and Minnesota on the center and the right here have done pretty well in the face of this retreat from marriage. And I think for rather different reasons, having to do either with culture or with social structure. So kind of where do we go from here? What is to be done with this set of findings in the report? Well, I think one clear conclusion that Americans across the spectrum would probably agree upon in the main is that we can do more to strengthen the economic foundations of family life, working class and poor Americans. And one way to go about doing that, as Bob Lerman has been talking about a lot lately, is to realize that most Americans don't actually get a college degree today, even today. And given that, when you think about alternative routes into the middle class, routes that encompass things like vocational education and apprenticeship training. And for that reason, we support apprenticeship legislation that's currently sponsored by Senators Tim Scott and Cory Booker. Again, it's one way to help Americans from less educated communities find a route into the middle class, which we think will then, of course, redound to the benefit of their families as well. A second point, and this point was, I think, articulated well this morning by Senator Sasse, is that we think it's very important for the government to do no harm when it comes to marriage and family life among low-income communities. And today, it's interesting, about a third of Americans are receiving some kind of means-tested benefit. So a substantial share of our population has some kind of encounter with the government on this particular outcome. And that's important because many of these benefits, things like Medicaid, for instance, and food stamps, end up penalizing marriage. One recent study suggested up to 30% of people's real income in some states. That's a lot of money. And so, given that, and given that the research suggests that the probability of marriage falls as the marriage penalty increases, we need to think very seriously about strategies for minimizing or eliminating the marriage penalty, particularly for lower-income couples with younger children. So that's one thing that we address in the report. And then the third point to make here, and again, this echoes what Senator Sasse said this morning, is that it's important for us here in Washington to realize that the answer to the challenges facing American families, fundamentally, I think in my view at least, I'm speaking now just for myself, I don't think really lies here in Washington or in Sacramento or in Lincoln or in Richmond or in Albany for that matter. I think that the solution here has to come from families, from civil society, from the pop culture, from folks who are producing movies and TV and songs in Southern California. And so it's in that spirit that I think we should think about it seriously, about a national campaign to expand cultural to expand civic and cultural supports for marriage and family life. One idea here is to talk about the success sequence, which Bell Sawhill and Ron Haskins have articulated at Brookings, the idea that you should finish your education, get a job, then get married, and then have kids. And if you do that, your odds of moving into the middle class and of staying free of poverty are higher. We also, I think, need to think very seriously about reaching less educated men. And David Lapp, I think, will be talking more about that in his remarks, because they are, in some important respects, both in the work world and the relationship world, floundering today. And for those of you who might think this is kind of a quixotic hope, that we could really change the dial here on something like family formation, I think it's important to recognize that we've actually done that. Since 1990, we've actually helped to bring the teen pregnancy rate down by about 50%, partly with the leadership the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Unplanned Pregnancy has provided on a related kind of outcome. So I don't think it's impossible to move the dial on this, but it does take a kind of collective consensual effort. And of course, that's a big challenge today on an issue like marriage and like stressing the value of putting marriage before the baby carriage. So to conclude, I think given the central role that marriage plays in fostering growth, prosperity, and the American dream in states across the nation, I think we need to renew the economic, the policy, the civic, and the cultural foundations of marriage and family life in this century. And let me be very clear here, there's no magic bullet when it comes to renewing marriage and families. Some, of course, will doubt the justice, and others the feasibility of such an endeavor. But this report demonstrates that some states have achieved a measure of success in resisting the nation's retreat from marriage. If more states could get behind public policies that do not penalize marriage, behind educational efforts that strengthen the earning power of young adults who are not on the college track, and voluntary private civic efforts to make the culture more marriage friendly, we just might see a renaissance in marriage and family life in America. And that would bring about improvement in not only the state of our unions, but also the wealth of our states. Or in more simple terms, that would make the experience of working class men like Doug Talby, who I introduced at the beginning today, less the exception and more the rule in American life. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad, very much. Ron?
So, good morning, and thank you for... Okay, good morning. So thanks very much, Bob and Brad, for the invitation. I thought that this paper very usefully adds to the literature about the benefits of marriage, and it does so in a new way in focusing not on individuals or families, but on the benefits of marriage for states. So as a matter of full disclosure, This issue is near and dear to my heart. I was raised by a mom who was separated and raised three boys in the South Bronx, and I celebrated my 40th wedding anniversary last month today. So I'm not surprised by these results in thinking about the differential experiences of myself and my sons. But I also, in particular, the finding that struck me most was that states in the top quintile of the distribution of states by the proportion of married couple families provide about a 10.5% greater mobility for children from lower income families than do states in the bottom quintile. So from the vantage point of social mobility, this report finds that that marriage is highly associated with the American dream. But I also have many colleagues who are skeptical of the literature generally. And I understand their reasons for skepticism. So I first want to applaud the authors because they address many of the concerns that these skeptics have. They are, for the most part, very cautious in not making causal assertions throughout the paper, although in the end they are making the case. And they are also very careful in the use of the individual and family level marriage literature in order to infuse their hypotheses about why marriage matters at the state level. And so it's sort of a full and rich document. But there are some ways in which I think the report misses some of the concerns of people who are skeptical about the role of marriage. And I want to spend the remainder of my time talking about those concerns of the skeptics, and as well as how the paper might address them, and in order to make their conclusions, to beat back the skepticism somewhat, since we're talking about policy implications. And I could group those concerns into three. One, first, cohabitation, which was raised in our earlier session. Secondly, what I want to call the aggregation problem. And thirdly, the issue of pay equity and omitted variables bias and the unit of observation. So if I were writing this paper, I would rerun the results to include the percent of cohabiting couples and children in cohabiting families in order to test the hypothesis that it is marriage rather than co-residence that is driving these results. In our last session, we talked about the rising importance of cohabitation since the mid-1970s, and the view among many people of childbearing age that marriage is that cohabitation is a substitute for marriage, and it is also a testing ground. So one of the reasons why divorce rates have fallen overall in the United States is because we are experiencing fewer lower quality marriages. To the extent that younger people test marriage, and again, I'm talking as a policy wonk and as a father of a 40-year-old and a 38-year-old, both of whom are married. So young people test marriage by cohabiting to see if does this right for us? And to the extent that they conclude that some of the matches are not good ones, they never marry in the first place, which is why 10, 15 years later, we observe lower divorce rates. So cohabitation is a big thing. And it could well be that many of the results that are found in the paper are a consequence of the idea that two incomes are better than one, two heads are better than one, and therefore, in states in which you bring two incomes to the table, you have higher median household income, you have higher GDP per capita, you have lower child poverty, and you have greater social mobility. So a simple way to sort of to test this hypothesis is that since 2007, the current population survey has included data on cohabitation, which means that you don't have this rich and long time series that is in the paper, but you could at least measure the state rates of cohabitation from 2007 to 2012, which means that you would be pushing the data because you couldn't do your state fixed effects as powerfully, you couldn't do your year fixed effects, but you would be testing the hypothesis over a period which is particularly important. We had a recession at the end of 2007, we've had a very slow recovery since then, and you could test a hypothesis that you could do it in one of two ways. One, you could measure the key independent variable here as the proportion of children or the proportion of couples couples who were two-parent couples and asked the question, is the association between, meaning married and cohabiting families, to see if the associations that you find between two-parent families and growth, child poverty, etc., are as strong as the associations that you find when you choose marriage alone. You could also, over that more limited period, include two critical independent variables. One, the marriage rate, and other, the cohabitation rate, and test the hypothesis that the coefficient on cohabitation and marriage is the same. So again, because cohabitation is a favorite topic and a real concern of the skeptics of this view, and you have the possibility since 2007 of including measures of the same similar measures of cohabitation rates as you do marriage rates, there's no reason why you should avoid going at that and providing the information that that will help people understand whether the hypotheses that you are working on that have to do with the effects of marriage on work effort, on savings, etc. Since we know that married couples are more likely to, Bob's work and others has shown that men who marry work longer and harder than men who cohabit. We know that married couples are more likely to save, more likely to buy homes. So there is the qualitative difference between marriage and cohabitation that you point out. However, it is true that both married and cohabiting couples bring two incomes to the table, and so this would help to distinguish whether or not these results are being driven by marriage or they're being by the pooling of income. And I think that would be it would lend or inform the skeptics of how these results are driven. Okay, so the next thing I want to think about is the aggregation problem, and that is the paper may be entirely right from the vantage point of what's important to policymakers. That is to say, if particularly those who are concerned with economic development or those who are concerned about reducing poverty. However, if states with higher marriage rates are states that have higher GDP growth, then the obvious conclusion for policymakers is to find ways to promote marriage. However, the implications for individuals and families are different. So suppose we accept the characterization that that higher marriage rates are states are with stronger families, okay? We might also accept the characterization that these same states are states with less diversity in family forms. And as a result, they are states in which members of non-traditional families might perceive some social stigma. However, individuals may be willing to pay for lower median income if they are located in communities where there is a greater diversity of families, and that's something that they like. So from the policymaker's vantage point, you obviously want higher median income in each household. But as a young person who appreciates diversity of all kinds, including the kinds of families who live in my community and whether or not I feel comfortable there, I may be willing to take a compensating wage differential and accept lower income in order to have the kinds of the diversity I want. Now, this is not facetious, this then leads us somewhere. So I noticed that New York, my home, ranks at the bottom, among states in terms of the presence of married parents. However, New York might also be considered one of the places around the country that is most diverse in terms of the types of families that are formed, and lots of people, young people of marrying age, want to go to places like New York because of that kind of diversity. And they might be willing to pay for it with somewhat lower incomes. So this raises a concern that might be difficult empirically for the authors to resolve, but it worries me that whether the unit of observation is the right one. So from the vantage point of state policy making, obviously the state level is important, but many of the arguments that the authors raise are arguments about labor market conditions. And it seems to me that SMSAs are better proxies for labor market conditions than states are. And this is really important because of people choosing residence in part as a function of the labor market in which they're going to live and whether or not that labor market provides opportunities for men and women, husbands and wives to function. So let me sort of just flesh out this idea. I live in New York, but I used to live in New Jersey, which means that my wife and I had the opportunity to benefit from, we lived in New Jersey, which performs better on these marriage outcomes than New York, but we had access to a New York labor market, a New York City labor market, which was very diverse. Therefore, my wife nor I had to suffer the consequences of the absence of diversity or had the benefits of the increasingly diverse economic atmosphere that is in New York, and both she and I could have had a job in New York City while we resided in New York. So similarly, you champion places like Virginia, which performs well on the marriage, but Virginia, or at least parts of it, is very closely located to Washington, D.C. So I know when I was here 20 years ago, I hung out with people who lived in Virginia, but who worked in Washington, D.C., and therefore it seems to me that the labor market, the metropolitan area, from the vantage point of the migration decisions that are related to family formation, are important in this argument that you're trying to make. And therefore, I wondered whether you could include a measure like the size of the metropolitan area, or the number of SMSAs in which a state is located, or whether, somewhat more drastically, your unit of observation should really be something like the county or the SMSA, so that we could understand how rich and diverse and large are the labor market opportunities to which the families or people that we're thinking about are exposed. Because again, a state is one thing, and you can sort of manipulate state policy, but the labor market really is a different jurisdiction and a different animal, and it seems to me that the kinds of labor market opportunities that are available are an important part of your story, and you're not really capturing that by making the whole unit of observation the state. Okay. My last concern has to do with this idea of pay equity. Okay. So you make this argument, and I also appreciate that the study tried to be balanced. Emphasis tried. They point out, so in figure 12 shows that American mothers are significantly less likely to be in the labor force than other women. So, but on net, while marriage rates may lower the labor force participation of women, they increase the labor force participation of young men, and on net, they argue, the gains that men accrue from marriage offset the losses that women may experience as a consequence of being married. So the implication for policymakers is this: if you want to increase economic growth, reduce child poverty, et cetera, raise marriage rates. So suppose we arrange the world in such a way that women who are either more productive or women who are highly educated located themselves in states where marriage rates were lower, in part so that they could work, okay? But suppose we also had a world in which there was greater pay equity. That would mean that if you increase marriage rates in places where you have lots of productive women living, then the idea is that you're going to lower marriage rates among women for whom the opportunity cost is highest, okay? And I worry about that. Would your results... So one of the things I would do is to include the ratio of male earnings to female earnings in this model, so that we could see if some of the results that you're getting are due to differences in pay equity. That is to say, is it possible that some of the gains to marriage are purchased at the cost of greater gender inequity in terms of the salaries that men and women earn? And again, as someone who was married for 40 years and had to traipse my wife around from one state to another, changing her job every time, the possibility that, again, I lived in a place where women's wages were higher versus lower made that movement much more sensible for us, and I dare say are also part of the ways in which young people think about choices about marriage, cohabitation, family formation, and where they're going to live. In many instances, it's a dual working couple, and in their movements, they have to think about what are the wages going to be like for me, but also what are the wages going to be like for her, and thinking about whether, again, it could be the case that we are purchasing, again, higher marriage rates at the cost of greater gender equity, and that would make us feel differently about the policy conclusions that we're thinking about. And so, again, from my own vantage point, again, these results are not surprising. They are important because they add a geographic dimension to a long-standing discussion. However, If these arguments are going to be made more persuasive to the skeptics, of which I'm not one, but I get it and I understand who they are, then I think you need to deal with some easy fixes and then some harder fixes. One has to do with incorporate cohabitation in the model. All right, so we can just say whether or not the returns to cohabitation on these scores are better than the return to marriage or vice versa. Secondly, worry about where the unit of observation is and figure out how to model the SMSA, which is a truer picture of what the labor market looks like, given your focus on states. And finally, worry about this issue of whether the ratio of male to female earnings is, which might be correlated with marriage rates, gives you an admitted variables bias in your work. Thank you.
Thank you. I comment this question of what can we do to strengthen marriage as a researcher who has spent some time interviewing working class young adults, and as well a practitioner, somebody who's trying to think about solutions on the ground. As a researcher, just for some background, my wife Amber and I, back in 2010, began interviewing working class and college educated young adults in the Southwest Ohio area. And over time, we began to focus on the working class young adults that we'd interviewed, and did some follow-up interviews with young people. And we're now writing those results in a book. So that's the research side. On the practitioner side, for the last year, we have been working with a website called IBelieveInLove.com that invites ordinary young people to share their own stories in their own words about the journey to find and keep lifelong love. These people have astonishing, amazing stories to share, and so we're trying to empower them to share their own stories and speak for themselves. I want to just mention one comment in response to what Ron Mincy had noted about cohabitation, and then I'll go and tell someone's story in particular. About cohabitation, surveys consistently show that the vast majority of young adults across classes want to get married. And we found this in our interviews. Of 75 working class young adults that we interviewed, we talked to 5 young people who said, I have no interest in getting married. And of those 5 people, a few of them had been divorced and were jaded about marriage, very cynical. A few of them had just recently, their engagements had been broken off because their fiance had cheated, and so they were also very cynical and jaded. The only person in our sample of 75 working class young adults who said, I'm not really that interested in marriage, was a married young man who, just for philosophical reasons, said, I don't think that's important, because he had thought it through and said, I don't think it's that important. The aspiration for marriage is very strong in communities where marriage has been hit hard. And so this is really, really important for us to understand when we're talking about strengthening marriage. It's not about us imposing the things that we would like on them and on their lives. It's about us joining them in their own aspirations for lifelong marriage. So I want to, with the rest of the time, I want to tell you the story of one young man that I've gotten to know through our work at I Believe in Love. His name is Tyler, and he's been sharing his story, and I've gotten to know him very well and consider him a good friend. Tyler, his parents divorced when he was very young. He was abused as a child and into adolescence. In junior high, his girlfriend committed suicide. And so by the time that he was 16 years old, he said that I was just looking for an escape from everything, and the next thing you know, he's smoking a bowl of meth. And for the next several years of life, he was just consumed by meth. He worked, but the meth actually helped him to work harder. But he was just completely addicted to meth. This went on for several years. He meets a girl, and within a week or so, they say that they're together, and he senses a love and acceptance from her that he has not felt in a long time. So because of that sense of love and acceptance, he tells her about his meth addiction, and she says, well, I'm going to love you no matter what, but if we're going to have a future together, you can't be addicted to meth. She takes his remaining meth, flushes it down the toilet, and then stands by his side for the next week as he goes through withdrawal. This was a profound experience for him. He said, everybody in the world judges all the time, but now here is somebody who is loving me, not judging me, but standing with me through this difficult time. soon after that, after he goes to that withdrawal, she gets pregnant with his child. In fact, when I first met Tyler, he had just found out that she was pregnant. He had an ultrasound, and I cannot describe to you the excitement and the profound meaning that this had for him. It completely changed him. In his own words, he said, "I started seeing life through a father's eyes." And it completely reoriented him. And for him, this is about proving to himself and to his future child that he wants to give his child the kind of stable family life that he didn't have growing up. He knows what it's like to experience the disorienting effects of divorce. He knows what it's like to experience instability. And the last thing that he wants is to give his own children that same experience. And so it profoundly moves him. He becomes a different man. And this experience of becoming a father. But it's not just, the literature on the fragile family study talks about the magic moment of becoming a father, and sometimes that kind of wanes. He sticks around. He proposes to his girlfriend, and he actually asks me to be the best man in the wedding. They set a date. They're going to go to the courthouse, and they're going to get married. The date is approaching of their wedding, and I can't get a hold of him. We've lost contact for a few weeks, and I'm like, is this, I'm trying to get a hold of him to figure out, we're going to go to the courthouse and get married. I'm the best man, but nothing, no contact. The day comes and goes, nothing. They don't get married. And finally, when I catch up with him again, I'm like, what's happening? And, he's basically what happened is he lost his job, life just gets crazy, and it just didn't happen. In the chaos and the instability of life. And I'd note, by the way, that a lot of young people that I talk to where they would be, who are cohabiting and delaying marriage, a lot of times they talk about the economic factors, but also as you talk to them, you get to know them more, you also hear about the distrust in their lives, saying things like, well, I don't know if I can trust her, or I don't know if I can trust him. And I really don't want to get divorced. The last thing that I do want to do is get divorced. And so there is also that. But, and with my friend Tyler, it's not that he has a low view of marriage. In fact, he wrote a piece about how he thinks about marriage. And I want to quote from what he says. He says that getting married is basically saying to the world, hey, this is my soulmate. This is who I want to spend the rest of my life with, through thick and thin. The world I want to live in is where I am hers and she is mine. We are one, a unity. And that's how I want us to be perceived by other people. What a profound statement. And he's not just espousing a soulmate view of marriage disconnected from children, because listen to how he talks about children. He says, when a man and woman have kids together, the kids become a part of the organism, the marriage organism, what he calls it. The mom, dad, and child are one big organism, one big unity. And if the couple works at marriage, it's good for the children. People that are married, their children live pretty good lives most of the time. If you've got two parents that support you the whole way, it's completely different than being on your own. You got a chance to grow up and win the Nobel Peace Prize. Yes, the kid who doesn't have two parents can still grow up and win the Nobel Peace Prize. But as someone who has personally experienced divorce as a child, let me say this. It makes it a hell of a lot easier if you've got two parents that are behind you every step of the way than if you've got just one. I mean, he gets it. He totally gets it. And so on paper, my friend Tyler, he's, for the 2 years that I've known him, he's a sometimes unemployed, poor young man bearing children out of wedlock. But I know him as Tyler, a person who has these very strong aspirations for marriage, and who has overcome way more obstacles in his life than I've ever had to overcome. So I think I'm a better man for knowing Tyler, and I think he'd say he's a better man for knowing me. And it's that experience of solidarity that I think is really, really important in coming alongside young people, respecting the working class, helping to think about how we can empower them, the people that are closest to the problems, to come up with the solutions.
That'll be a tough one to follow. Is this? It's on? No, there it is. Okay. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be commenting on this report. I thought I would just step back a little bit to Brad's original remarks and just sort of talk for a minute about different pieces of them, starting with, and these will be slightly disconnected thoughts, but starting with just the idea of states as sort of a useful way to sort of break down the breakdown of the family in the United States. And I think it's interesting that Ron sort of dove into one way of looking at the problem with looking at states, right, which is that people don't move to Pennsylvania for a job, they move to the Philadelphia metropolitan area for a job. People in Northern Virginia are working in DC and living in Virginia and so on. And in certain ways, I completely agree. I think when you're sort of making these kind of measurements, it's useful and important to keep that in mind, to keep the fact that people live in metropolitan areas in many cases more than they live in states in mind, even though, of course, metropolitan areas don't make public policy in quite the same way that states do. But I wanted to take sort of the opposite tack and say that, one way to think about sort of the state of marriage and family in America is not to look at the U.S. as sort of 50 different mini polities, 50 different mini political cultures, mini cultures, but to sort of look at what you might call folkways in American life. And those of you who've read or pretended to read, as I have, Albion's Seed by David Hackett Fisher, know about just the idea that you can sort of trace a lot of cultural and political developments in early U.S. history just by tracking the migrations of particular groups of people, Scots-Irish, Puritan East Anglian stock in the Northeast and so on across the United States. And I think to some extent that's also a useful way of looking at patterns in marriage and family today. And it also provides a useful way of thinking about public policy that, to a large extent when we talk about sort of the effects of both the economic trends and the social trends that we've experienced over the last 50 or 60 years, we're talking about their effects on sort of discrete cultural groups in a way. And the effects are different. They differ with geography, they differ with culture, they differ with ethnic background, and so on. And to take sort of, this also complicates one of the ways that we've ended up talking about family structure a lot in the U.S. recently, which is the sort of red family versus blue family dynamic, which is associated with Naomi Kahn and June Carbone, two sociologists, and Brad has had some very interesting back and forths with them on this issue. But really, as you can see from the data in this report, there are multiple models of red family life and multiple models of blue family life. The red family life that you see in states in the Deep South looks very different than the red family life that you see in the High Plains, which looks somewhat different, though somewhat closer to the red family life that you see in sort of the heart of Mormondom in Utah and then the Mormon penumbra. And similarly, when you talk about blue family life, it makes a big difference whether you're talking about blue states, like the sort of wealthiest blue states, often the whitest blue states, places in the Northeast, the Pacific Northwest, and so on, whether you're talking about what you might call sort of the secularized Catholic blue-collar Midwest, Michigan being sort of a primary example, also Ohio, or whether you're talking about the increasingly Hispanic Southwest and large parts of California, which again have their own distinctive pathways, and then in the South too, with the African American population, you get very distinctive effects in terms of family structure as well. And it would take a sort of David Hackett Fisher style book to sort of tease out how all these dynamics work together. But just in terms of the policy conversation that Brad wants to start, I think it would be particularly useful to sort of try and cluster states, not in terms of red and blue, but within these sort of large but not too large cultural groupings, and then compare public policy outcomes in certain ways, and say, well, you have certain patterns that are clear that run deeper than policy in Mississippi and Alabama. You have certain patterns in sort of the Scots-Irish belt again, that run deeper than public policy in Arkansas, Kentucky, up through West Virginia, and so on. You have certain patterns that, run deeper than public policy in Utah and Idaho, certain patterns in states with high shares of Hispanic immigrants, and so on. But what are those states, what can we see that particular states within those belts are doing right or seem to be doing right? Is there a state in that Scots-Irish belt? Is Kentucky doing something that Arkansas isn't doing? Is Alabama doing something that Mississippi isn't doing? Is there a difference between sort of different high plains states, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, and so on? And obviously, all of that in turn runs into all kinds of confounding variables, and any public policy argument does. But I think that that's one way to sort of take the kind of rich state-based data in this report, but also recognize that those states are not sort of themselves the only reality shaping marriage and family, and that they're these sort of bigger folkways, really, that explain in part why different parts of the country have had such divergent reactions to social trends over the last 50 years. So that would be my first point. And then two sort of, I guess, smaller, maybe related points about the arguments Brad's making. I tend to be, and I've probably said this in this room, both very supportive of sort of any kind of state-based experimentation with everything from vocational training, marriage prep, and so on. Supportive, but also skeptical, and that some of that is rooted in a broader skepticism about public policy's effect on the marriage rate. But I also think that there is a sense in which government tends to be a lot better at, in a word, writing checks than it does at sort of character formation programs, in particular. And vocational education falls in a somewhat different category, but there too, I think that there is a sense in which, and this is a conservative insight in certain ways. I'm probably stealing it from Charles Murray. Maybe he's stealing it from someone else. But there is a sense in which, when it's a conservative insight, but it's also a way that I think conservatives and liberals can find a certain amount of common ground, because one of the reasonable liberal points in these kind of debates is, whatever you think about the direct effect of economics on culture, and I tend to share the view that Brad expressed, that you can't just look at economic trends and get to an explanation of family breakdown over the last 30 or 40 years. The Great Depression is sort of the extreme counterexample, but you can dig in deeper, and it gets very hard, I think, to make that case. But whatever you think about it, I think we all agree that the U.S. economy has not performed amazingly well for working class Americans, and particularly working class men, over the last 40 or 50 years. And when conservatives are arguing it's not all the economy, we're usually saying, look, male wages haven't fallen. They haven't fallen as much as you think they have. They're flat or stagnant, but they haven't fallen off a cliff when you make these adjustments. And I buy that argument, but it's clearly the case that male wages are not rising at the kind of pace that, American society got accustomed to, and we're happy that it got accustomed to in the post-war period. And, that's an area where obviously sort of macroeconomic policy and so on makes a difference, but it's also an area where you can just say things like, well, look, this is a case for a larger earned income tax credit. This is a case for a wage subsidy substitute for the earned income tax credit. This is a case for a larger child tax credit. And the conservative side of the argument will want these kind of programs to be bonded in some way to responsibility, to work and family, basically, in some form, so that they aren't just effectively sort of subsidizing what, the sort of phenomenon that Megan was talking about in the previous panel of sort of, the guy on the couch playing video games because he didn't get along with his boss and so on. You want to be subsidizing familial responsibility, but you do probably want to be subsidizing it a little bit, given the trends, or a little bit more than we are now, given the overall economic trends. And if I were betting on any public policy intervention, I'd bet on that a little bit more than I would bet on targeted programs that are trying to teach people how to be husbands and fathers. Not that those programs can't work, I'm just skeptical of the government's ability to craft them, and I would be much more confident and hopeful about sort of more diffuse private or religious-based efforts. And then the last point I would just make is that I've been on a number of these panels with Brad. Brad is always very kind to invite me. And I often express and will express again skepticism that American elite culture is at all capable of the kind of strong messaging that he and I too would like to see it offer on marriage and family. And I think, you can see hints of the reason why that might be in some of Ron's comments about sort of, I think, whatever we think about the premium that the average American places on family diversity in their everyday experience, I think it's very clear that elite America places a strong premium on the idea of family diversity as something worth celebrating and supporting and experiencing, even if elite Americans themselves are perhaps don't have quite as much family diversity as some of the families that the Laps are working with in the Midwest. But that idea of family diversity as a positive achievement runs very deep at the elite level of American society for reasons connected to same-sex marriage in particular, I think, right now, but really more generally just as a kind of ideological view of the goods that the sexual revolution ushered in. And I think that there is a difference between what would be required for a campaign around sort of marriage qua marriage versus the campaign around teen pregnancy. I think the campaign around teen pregnancy, one, I'm skeptical of how much of an effect it really had for reasons I just stated, but two, the campaign around teen pregnancy is a campaign about telling people to be more careful who they have sex with and delay having sex for a few years. And that's a message that a essentially liberal and permissive elite, they have kids, they can get behind that message because, it's about don't have a kid at 16, basically. But that, I think, extending that message out further into the life cycle to a point where you seem to be in any way judging or stigmatizing people who don't fit into sort of an approved family model, extending that message out in ways that have any kind of implications for the sexual liberties of 20-somethings and so on. I think we're a long way from the elite levels of American society having, at the very least, having the level of consensus about sort of the good of the family to make that kind of pitch in a sustained way. So those are my three thoughts. I'll leave things there.
Thank you all three of you. And I have to, it was very good, and I'm going to take the privilege of the moderator to make a few comments of my own, just in response, and also to raise the first question. First of all, I think this is a very important study, and I believe, we haven't mentioned anything about Raj Chetty's work, but it does seem to me it does follow on to that indicated that there was a big indicator of the extent to which people were able to be upwardly mobile, was the extent to which the communities they lived in had married families or predominance of single-parent families. And so I think that's an important discussion that's going on in the country about upward mobility and differences across area. And I think, Ron, your introduction of the SAMHSAs is a very good one. But as a former policy maker and implementer, I really focused on what the three recommendations, and I wanted to just sort of give a quick reaction. When it comes to VOCAD and efforts to increase the economic prospects for young men and improve different kinds of education outcomes so their earnings could rise, completely for it. I think it's got bipartisan support. I think most governors would say, yes, let's do that. I would say as a social services commissioner, that's very nice, but I don't know how much it'll really do in the long run. So I would be skeptical, as Ross would, of what it would accomplish. When it comes to penalties in social services programs, we just have to be honest. Those are not based on state policies. They're very much based on federal policies. And people have been talking about marriage penalties and for a long time, and to correct them is extremely expensive. And I'm not exactly sure, again, how that really is the holy grail to turn this around. So that gets me to and I have a distinction between programs which promote on a family basis or an individual basis versus the elite discussion of the public relations campaign. And here I am less skeptical than Ross. I do feel that a greater cultural message and centered around outcomes for children can have staying power in elite society on the left and the right. And the data on that is just so strong. You've turned on economic prosperity, and everybody wants to have a better growing state. You combine that with also outcomes for children. I do have some belief that if I was in a governor's office and I could carry that off, I would go for that. Because even left and right, everybody's about trying to help children have better outcomes. And I guess, but I would also recognize, and Ron and all of you can comment on this, and Ross, you talked about elite society as if it was one big elite. But you know, there are right elites and left elites. And the right elite has been saying this for a long time, in some respects, one could say.
All 16 of us.
Yeah, right? That's right. But the question is, how do we get people who have greater credibility with the communities that are often have this issue the most significant to talk more about that? Do we have hope there? And I think that's the key. And I just wondered, is there any sign that that we're besides, you know, I quote Michelle Obama, I quote the president all the time on this issue, and there are obviously other examples. But what else can we do to get that part of the cultural elite to be more open to talking about the benefits for children and states and job formation of having more stable families? So turn your microphone.
Sorry. What I like about the report is that, to me, it does the necessary and sufficient condition. Because what for me, first of all, that leadership group that you're thinking about is not necessarily African American, is not necessarily Latino. It probably is a leadership group that is has credibility among working class whites as well as the other two communities. So that's one thing. The second thing is what a thought leader in that domain would have to say is, yes, I want to point you toward the results that suggest that individuals in states, et cetera, who live in married couple families because of the stability, they have better outcomes for kids. But I also want to make that feasible, right? And it's hard to have that conversation to say get married unless you can also say, and we're going to do some stuff, right, to make marriage a more feasible outcome, which is what I like about the report, because it has the two punch. It says, do stuff to raise the wages, particularly of young men of marriageable age. At the same time, you're promoting this ideal of marriage. So it's putting out the goal, but it's saying, I acknowledge that if your employment situation is unstable and your plans for marriage can get diverted because you lose a job, I'm not going to just say, oh, but go back and get married. I'm going to worry about what you're worried about, namely the fact that you can't put a paycheck consistently before you. And so I think the message in the work is two-part. Let's be clear about what the data shows about the benefits of marriage, but also let's be concerned about, as you argued, what they are concerned about, namely, how am I going to pull this off, right? And so I think it has to be a two-part stream. And we're not, consistently about both parts of that message, it seems to me.
Brad, do you want to comment on either that? What policy lever is your favorite? Do you think is the most likely to succeed, or does it really require effort on all three?
Well, I mean, I completely agree with Ron in the sense that I do think, if we can identify those levers that will strengthen the opportunities in the labor force, particularly of less educated men, I'm completely around any and all efforts to do that. I think the challenge still is empirically, do we see good levers out there? And I don't think we've gotten, a clear indication that those levers are easily pulled. But if we can find them, identify them, and insofar as vocational, training and apprenticeship training is part and parcel of that, insofar as an expanded EITC or some other kind of wage supplement's part of that, I'm all for it. But again, I also want us to sort of acknowledge the point that Megan McArdle made earlier today, and that is that in a different era when the material constraints were much greater than they are today for many Americans, marriage, family life were stronger. And that suggests that culture matters, not just culture, as I think as David Lapp's work in Ohio suggests, there was a kind of a tissue of extended kin, of civic institutions, of churches that were there for people, that supported them, but also fostered trust. And we know that trust is built in and through social networks. both in relationships, marriages, but just more generally speaking. And the unfortunate reality is Robert Putnam's work and Charles Murray's work tells us is that sort of the civil society tissue, if you will, has been rent by lots of things, by cultural shifts, by economic shifts. And so absent, reconstituting for our day and our moment more vital civic institutions, I think all of this, becomes much more unfeasible.
And yeah, I would just say that the easiest policy lever to pull of all is the writing of the checks, and the EITC is an example of that. It is the simplest thing. You do it, it's in, everybody feels good. But if you don't get the other, which you won't get, you might be just writing checks again and not really changing the dynamics.
So I think the other thing, since we're talking about, elites and leadership, et cetera, I think the thing that may trip liberal elites up on this is that their children, they take a buy with respect to their own children at the point at which they're making these decisions, because their own kids are in college, right? They are hooking up. They're doing all varieties of things at the point at which they're advising children who will never go to college, young adults, to get married. So it's sort of there is an element of hypocrisy, right, suggesting that, we know that our kids are doing whatever they want to do between the time they're 20 and 25, and they are cohabiting between 20 and 25, but when they graduate and get their degrees, they will settle down, figure out, marry that person, and go on and do, and they are also contracepting so that they don't get pregnant. At the same time, we are asking them to advise lower income children, oh no, you guys are going to get married between 20 and you guys are going to have kids between 21 and 25, and therefore you ought to get married now, or we ought to make sure that you are actively contracepting so that the sexual activity that our kids get away with won't get you pregnant. So again, we are asking elites on the liberal side to be hypocritical about what they advise poorer kids to, not working class kids to do, versus what their own kids are doing. And I think we have to acknowledge that if you're talking,
fair point. But another way of looking at it is that highly educated families are much higher marriage rates, and elite families are getting married. And in fact, what they're not doing is not preaching what they practice. Is they're actually, so I think you can look at that either way. But that does raise the issue of contraception, and which is not covered in the report, but there's another discussion going on.
Right, and that's, the prevailing, I think the current prevailing liberal view, to caricature a little bit, is precisely, it basically says, well, right, we've sort of figured things out for our kids. We let them have their, Rumspringa between the ages of 18 and 27 or something. And it's a little more complicated than that when you actually dig into who hooks up in college and who doesn't and so on. It's not totally clear that sort of elite level college students are actually having the wild bacchanal. Some of that, there's this dynamic there too of sort of, there's this media image that sort of preaches the idea of college as this wild bacchanal, and then if you look at how these kids actually behave. I was one of them. We talked about having sex a lot, theoretically. Always remember. I'm sorry. I have a college friend would like to say this is maybe not for a family audience, but I'm a virgin by choice, the choice of the women of America. It's one of my favorite lines. But anyway, to go back, sorry, after that digression, the liberal view is right. We have this, we figured it out for our own kids, and we increasingly recognize that the conditions for working class Americans, maybe most Americans, are different, that not everyone is going to college, not everyone has these family support structures that are teaching them how to contracept, not directly, but sort of implicitly, intuitively. Not everyone has these sort of sense of like, all right, well, you don't get your girlfriend pregnant at age 19 and so on. So this is where long-acting contraception comes in. And it's seen increasingly, I think, as, magic bullet might be overstating the case, but it's seen as sort of the way to say, okay, even people in sort of disrupted families and broken communities can't live the way kids at, Cornell and Wesleyan do. they sort of live the way kids at Wesleyan do, but that's a different story. But they can't sort of, but with long-acting contraception, they don't have to. They can continue to have these sort of, these sort of chaotic personal lives, but they won't get pregnant so quickly. And that's I don't sort of have, I think my skepticism about that approach in part is just rooted in the idea that, if the problem is that these people have chaotic family lives and chaotic economic lives, that they, aren't getting married, not because they don't want to be responsible, but because they, lose their job or something. If those are the problems, then long-acting contraception could help by, people will have their kids later in life, people get more settled as they get older, and so on. But it could also just sort of perpetuate the sort of social dysfunction, right? And say, well, of course I don't have to of course I can cheat on my, in your work, there's so much stuff of people cheating on their fiancés, cheating on their girlfriends, these sort of, that leads to sort of serial, not serial, but multi-partner fertility down the road, right? And okay, if you do away with some of the fertility there in the multi-partner fertility, you have less of a problem, but you're still dealing with people who are in multi-partner situations that aren't conducive to long-term stability. So there is a sort of like, it's a stopgap, and it maybe doesn't. What it would do, I think, is drive down the birth rate, right? Like, I think that that I'm very confident that long-acting contraception, if really rigorously pushed by the government, would probably lead to lower. I shouldn't say I'm really confident, but I'm somewhat confident at least. I think that would be the mechanism. But the birth rate for working class Americans isn't that high.
No, it's not.
Right? That's part of the issue, right? And this is why people end up having kids. People are delaying fertility somewhat. They aren't all having kids at 21. People want to have kids, and they're not. It's not like the birth rate for Americans without a college degree is 6.7 children per woman or something. It's much lower than the birth rate was for most Americans 40 or 50 years ago, and frankly, it's the only thing keeping the American birth rate from heading to sort of, dire German levels. And there's a whole nother complicated argument there. But anyway, that's sort of getting into a little skepticism on that front.
Okay, so we're going to open up for questions from the audience, and like the last time, we'll take one from there, and one from there, and one from there, and then we'll see how it goes. Is that all right? Okay.
Hi, just to say I'm a journalist, Penny Starr with CNS News, and I think you've touched on these issues, but I really think there's three things, if I may, that I think play into this conversation that haven't really been talked about directly. One is when you talk about do no harm, the federal government, according to my reporting people I've talked to, they incentivize not being married. I've actually interviewed women who say they live with their boyfriend and they have children with him, but they don't marry him because they will lose benefits. That's one of the things. The other is, Ross touched on it, pop culture. Sort of the poster child of that is Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, who said, who lived together, had children, adopted children, and said they would not get married until same-sex marriage was the law of the land. And third, I would say that when you talk about contraceptives, I would bring up abortion as something that has become a way of never living up to not having to take responsibility for your actions. So when people knew that if they got pregnant, they're going to have that child, or did something horrific to stop that, now people know that there are no consequences if you get pregnant. So I think there's these things that are embedded in our culture that would have to be overcome in many ways to make marriage and family, again, something that's revered and looked up to as the ideal way of life. So I'm hoping you can comment on those three things.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Irina Grosu with Family Research Council. I have one question, one comment that I'd like commentary back on. But my first question is, in terms of the fact that there are marriage penalties, increasing a child tax credit, when we look at what, for example, Germany or other countries are doing to incentivize having children, that would help America if there were more economic incentives, as well as paid family leave. As we know, that's really awful here in America. We're one of the lowest countries in that regard. And also in terms of, this came up before, but the idea that college should be more affordable, if not free. I have a friend who lives in Germany who said, I don't understand the American system where you're spending 10 years, 12 years paying off your college education, whereas every German high school graduate goes on to college for free. So in terms of helping to incentivize having families early, I think that those are the areas that we could work on and improve. So I'd like your feedback on that. And with regard to contraceptives and cohabitation, looking at our data, especially, so we run the Mary Institute at FRC, and then also looking at the studies I've seen, contraceptive use actually increases abortion rates, and because contraceptives ultimately fail, especially when they're not used right or regularly, etc. And also, cohabitation has been shown to increase divorce rates. So I'd like Ron's take and the rest of the panel's take on that.
And I think we had one over there.
Hi, Peter Kunze with Justice Fellowship. I was particularly interested in the finding related to violent crime. Obviously, with the Justice Fellowship, we're concerned about criminal justice. So I'd be curious if there are any thoughts on what the interaction would be between criminal justice policy, which is certainly a very complex beast and has a lot of details there, but the interaction between policies and potential reforms there and the potential to strengthen or perhaps weaken families through that. So yeah, just the interaction between criminal justice policy and families as a whole.
So, a lot there. Brad, do you want to take any or all of those?
Couple of those questions, and in terms of the first set of questions, I would agree that it's pretty clear that many of our means-assisted policies are sort of misaligned when it comes to marriage, and I think poor Americans are like other Americans; they think strategically, and if it doesn't make sense to get married, that's going to sort of shape your approach to getting married. And I think we should look at experimenting at the state level with at least some measures to address that. And if it has an effect, we should think about changing federal public policy in that regard. On the questions related to the child tax credit and paid family leave and the affordability of higher education, I think that those are all issues that social conservatives, I think, look at a bit differently than do economic conservatives in both here in D.C. and elsewhere. But I think we have to be sort of thoughtful about the role of unintended consequences in pursuing policies that might, for instance, make college more affordable or provide paid family leave. Are there different ways that we can advance those policies that don't have huge impacts either on the federal budget or have unintended consequences for American families? And I've talked about that more in some of my writings. On the cohabitation piece, it's important for us to realize that we're seeing, based upon a piece we published about 3 weeks ago in Family Studies, that even in Europe, people who are married are much more likely to kind of go the distance than Europeans who are cohabiting. This is true across many European countries. So sort of this idea that cohabitation kind of works better in Europe is true to an extent, but only to an extent. And so I think in responding to Ron's point about looking at cohabitation, which we should do in the paper, we also have to acknowledge that, both here in the U.S. and even in Europe, families that are organized around cohabitation are much more likely to break up. And that instability is challenging, and it ends typically in single parenthood as well, which has an impact that we're all aware of. Finally, on the violent crime front, we do show a strong link between married families and lower levels of violent crime in the U.S. And the question, in part, which I think you're getting at, is whether or not criminal justice reform at sort of a different end of this whole equation might reintegrate, many men, particularly many less educated working class and poor men, into their communities in ways which would be helpful to their partners and their kids. And there's certainly some evidence to suggest that that might be a way of strengthening, that as criminal justice reform would be a way of strengthening families, and maybe also breaking the cycle when it comes to family or father absence and the delinquency and criminal activity of young adults and teens.
So my only observation is I'm just not aware of the work about the relationship between cohabitation and higher divorce rates, and I just wonder what the counterfactuals are. So that if we do know that it has the effect that I was articulating, but there are two kinds of people who cohabit. Those are people who cohabit sort of casually, and there are people who cohabit planning to marry. And some of the difference between the divorce rates has to do with sort of the intentions, and I'd be very interested in actually looking at the study. I think on the cost of education thing, what I find intriguing about some of the examples that have been raised, particularly yours, is that to me in the data, the most frightening aspect of young people choosing the path other than the one recommended by Sawhill and Haskins is that once a young woman has a non-marital birth, the probability that she will ever have a marital birth drops precipitously, right? And so this idea of recovering from a non-marital birth is very difficult to do for her, but it's also very difficult for him. Because often when we talk about expanding higher education and making it cheaper, we do not take into account that very few less educated men go to community colleges or anything else. And one of the reasons is that their child support obligations are not, you can't set them aside. If a young woman who becomes pregnant can still go to community college in order to figure out how to make her lifelong trajectory higher. A young man who has a child out of wedlock and has a child support obligation, if he has to change his class schedule, work part-time, do anything different, is unable to go to community college. And so we have to do something about the ways in which, if we look at this, several years ago, the issue of this journal focused on fragile families. And there was an author who wrote a paper about the role of community colleges in this whole nexus. And I asked the author, how many of those people who go to community colleges are men? And she said, oh, no, sorry, virtually none are. So we have to think, in thinking about expanding high school education, expanding apprenticeship programs and the like, we have to think about the differential ways in which those opportunities are going to extend to men and women because of the ways we treat how we make young men and women responsible for children after they have one who was born out of wedlock.
I want to say something about the comment about paid family leave, and because I think there really is an opportunity here for conservatives to see the importance of, to see the opportunity for strengthening marriage and families by looking at the work piece. I mean, I went into my research pretty skeptical that I thought it was mostly about culture and attitudes, but then I see a young couple, they're married. She works, she goes to work at 4 in.the morning and is there until about 1 o'clock. And they have 3 kids. He stays and watches the kids. And then he goes in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and gets home about midnight. And they're on the schedule 6 days out of the week. Their only off day is Sunday, and that's only because he insists on not working on Sundays. And, I mean, that's just a very hectic life. It's very chaotic. This affects for them, I mean, they're married, but, it affects the quality of their married life, and it could ultimately lead to divorce. We hope not. But even if we are skeptical about using policy instruments for addressing the work aspect, whether wages or working conditions, what is something that business leaders, business owners, people in the boardroom, how can we in the private sector, how can we think about, okay, how could I increase the likelihood that my workers are having a more stable life, and that I'm not contributing to the chaos through the work that we provide, but actually helping to elevate the stability. That's something that we can talk about. We don't have to talk about the minimum wage. We don't have to talk about policies. Let's just talk about what we in the private sector can do through as business leaders to help strengthen our families.
The final word.
Well, just briefly, I guess, to the last question about criminal justice reform. I mean, I think that there's no question that when you're talking about sort of the prospects for working class and less educated young men, the incarceration rate has to be part of the story. It's how much of the story is open for debate, or I guess what you could say is how there are sort of two debates. One is, does mass incarceration drive the breakdown of the family, or is it a consequence? And that's another chicken and egg debate that we could go round and round with. But I think there is a fair amount of evidence that that a lot of the trends that we're talking about precede the incarceration boom, and so you can't just assume that that's the entirety of the story, but it is part of the story. And then connected to that is the question of, well, what do you do about it? And again, I think, the nature of the crimes that people are actually locked up for means that there are limits to what you can do with criminal justice reform before you run into significant public resistance to releasing people who are convicted of violent crimes. But there is stuff you can do, and I think things like the bipartisan push on federal sentencing that we're seeing is a step in the right direction. I think projects at the state level have been steps in the right direction, just in terms of, for the same reason, just as, child support payments can prevent young men from getting an education, a criminal record can prevent them from getting a job, and if there are ways to have fewer young men with criminal records overall and fewer young men entering the prison system entirely, then that would probably be for the good in terms of enabling them to grow up to be husbands and fathers. And I think I'll just leave things there. Thanks.
This has been a great day. I want to thank Brad especially and his co-authors and I hope we all will give everybody a round of applause. Thank you.